Welcome to the ReZero Season 4 Supercut, the complete collection of all my cut content for Season 4 Part 1. If you wanted to know exactly what the anime left out from the novels, this entire video will cover all of it. Let's get started. Episode 67, The Reason I'm Taking You With Me, covering Chapter 7 from Volume 20 of the light novel and Chapter 1 from Volume 21. Several glaring problems still needed solutions after the fight for Priestella, one of which was Crush and her affliction while the other was Capella's victims. For both, Subaru did have an answer, it's just both were equally difficult to achieve. For the former, he had no problem absorbing all of Crush's curse himself, while for the latter, that required taking Capella's witch factor for himself. Neither were very ideal though, so that made both a last resort for when no other answers were available. I mean, it's not like Subaru wanted to go through the pain of absorbing Crush's curse, but he definitely would if it meant relieving Crush of her pain. Then, when it came to acquiring Capella's witch factor, that meant killing her and stealing it. Learning how to use it after was a problem in and of itself, since despite now possessing both Sloth and Greed's witch factor, Subaru didn't have the slightest clue on how to use Greed's. So adding a third on top of that would just make things harder. Now, the biggest problem was of course the victims of gluttony, a fate Subaru once believed couldn't get more tragic than Rem's. Well, with Julius getting to experience his erasure firsthand, that to Subaru had to be even more tragic. He wasn't one who liked to compare suffering, but to be conscious while the world around you completely forgot about you, that had to be a special type of torture. Just look at how emotional Garfield got when only his mother forgot about him. Imagine that feeling then applied to everyone. So, Subaru could more than sympathize with what Julius was going through, and it's him along with all the other victims that would lead them onto their next mission. A journey to find the all-knowing Shala the Sage. She currently resided in the Pleiades watchtower across the Agoria dunes at the far eastern edge of Lagunica, making the trip to her a lengthy one. It was actually the setup for this trip that would largely be cut down. So, Otto would stay behind to heal his legs and retrieve the Tome of Wisdom from Darts, while Garfield would do the same as he was the one who had to heal Otto. The city also needed someone to protect them just in case the witch cult came back, at least until the city was recovered anyway. Subaru and Julius would have a moment amongst the victims of gluttony, a cutscene which highlighted how gluttony was the worst amongst the archbishops. Sure, all the archbishops were the accumulation of the worst possible malice, but the way gluttony desecrated every life they touched made them especially evil. Julius, however, had quite the unique perspective, as his precarious situation made the state of the other victims seem like a blessing. Since none would ever know they'd been forgotten, they would never have to experience the anxiety and fear that came with being left behind. For Julius, having all his bonds severed just like that was painful. It was a pain which made him question whether it was worse to have forgotten or be forgotten. That then led to the whole scolding Subaru would give him in this scene here, a stern talking to that would serve as the motivation for Julius to accompany them. After that came the conversation with Anastasia, still in the city of Priestella since the plan for the watchtower hadn't been formalized yet. Now, the reason Subaru would be so blunt about Anastasia not being who she was is because he wanted to make sure it wasn't lust. It wasn't unlikely that the two swapped places, so that was a worry he needed to dispel quickly. Echidna was the one name he wasn't expecting though, so when Anastasia said it, Subaru naturally snapped. It didn't take long for Echidna to realize Subaru's malice was directed towards her creator, the real Echidna, so making that distinction allowed the two to talk a bit more freely. Subaru wasn't as agreeable as how we saw in the anime though, since with the way Echidna acted just like her creator, that didn't sit too well with him. There was this annoying attitude behind her words that made it seem like she didn't understand how the people she was dealing with were feeling. It was a trait Subaru had become all too familiar with. It's for that reason he would continue probing her for any inconsistencies, one in particular being how she could sense Beatrice was an artificial spirit while somehow Beatrice couldn't do the same for her. Well, she supposedly possessed a sense allowing her to detect artificial spirits, one that didn't really work when used on her. Reason being that she was more of an incomplete artificial spirit. She could neither contract with a human or properly utilize her magic, making detecting her true nature difficult. That meant the witch cult could very well have been after her, but whether that was actually true or not, no one could say. Now, for a bit more context on why Aridina just couldn't switch back, it all came down to Anastasia's gate. You see, hers was defective from birth, unable to absorb atmospheric mana like how it normally should. A functional gate can absorb mana, store it within the body, then release it, but for Anna, that first step was non-functional. It made it so she was in a chronic state of mana deprivation. This was the exact opposite of how Reinhardt's gate works, since where he absorbs insane amounts of mana, his body can't really expel it. No, instead it's used to significantly enhance all his physical capabilities. It's for that reason he can't use magic, but it's also for that very same reason he's so incredibly powerful. It's actually a very similar condition to Subaru's, except where Reinhardt depletes his mana just by living, Subaru unfortunately does not. When it comes to Anastasia, with her never having a sufficient amount of mana, should she ever want to use magic, she would have to rely on her internal mana. That in turn exhausts her odd, which as we know is the foundation of life. So unless Anna willingly chose to shorten her lifespan, she could never contract with a spirit, as doing so requires mana. Why then is Aridina borrowing her body now? Well, it turns out Anastasia was in such a dangerous position she had no choice but to. It was safer to reduce her lifespan than risk dying right there in the moment. Luckily for her, Aridina isn't a high mana consumption spirit, so her existence isn't usually a burden on Anna. Now, if Aridina didn't know anything other than what her name was, what she is, and who created her, you're probably wondering how she knew about the Watchtower then. Well, Aridina chalked it up to fate, but what she really meant is that her creator likely wanted her to go there. It was just like Echidna to etch a path and nothing else into one of her creations. This went to make Subaru nervous, as if something connected to Echidna was waiting at the tower, he knew it definitely wasn't going to be good. It was after that Aridina would ask a question of her own, and that was what her creator was like. This was a question Subaru refused to answer though, since at the moment he still wasn't sure whether he could trust her or not. So his connection to Echidna was a secret he would save for a later day. Subaru would then give some tips on how Aridina could better act the part, and finally it would be Aridina who would suggest Subaru should bring Rem. According to her, it was probably best to bring a living example of their problem, so who better than the person Subaru wanted to save most? In a way, Aridina almost sounded like a devil offering a deal, but to Subaru, this deal was far too good to pass up. Next came a whole cutscene with Reinhardt, the ally Subaru conveniently placed outside his meeting with Anastasia. If it turned out she actually was Lust, then Subaru wanted someone powerful to be there to fight alongside him. So it was in this conversation that we would hear about Reinhardt's own journey to the Watchtower, a failure which ultimately led to the reason for the royal selection today. That's right, because Reinhardt couldn't get to the tower 2 years ago, he was never able to find a cure to the royal family's illness, and that resulted in all those afflicted by it to end up dying. Why did Subaru think they could get through the desert now then? Well, that's because Aridina told him they could. Apparently, she somehow knew a way to get past the barrier, a secret path that completely bypassed it. Subaru would then end the conversation by asking if Reinhardt was okay, mainly because he did just go through something pretty emotional. Reinhardt made it seem like he was, but whether that was actually true, Subaru wasn't sure. All he could do was believe what Reinhardt was saying. If he said that he finished his farewells to his grandmother, then there was no reason for Subaru to not think he was okay. Next came a scene involving Beatrice, Subaru, and Amelia, but that was shown in part for the finale of Season 3. All it did was wrap up the events of the Pristella arc, following it up with Subaru's consideration of whether he could actually take advantage of the circumstances. Specifically, whether he should bring Rem along to save her first or not. Perhaps it was greedy to think he should, but no matter how much he thought about it, he couldn't help but wish one more girl was right there with him. So, that brings us now to when they were on their way back home, an opportunity Julius would take to reveal something about his past. I won't say what it is since they'll likely mention it in a future episode, but the reason he did is because he wanted Subaru to know more about him. He was, after all, the sole person in the world that knew him best now. It was that same night that Beatrice would come to comfort Subaru, as she alone knew all that which troubled him. His main concern was of course Aridina. In identity, he decided not to share with the others, but just to be safe, shared with Beatrice. So she too was aware of Anastasia's little secret. 10 days later, and they would finally make it back to the manor, making Subaru's total time in Pristella about a month. Petra's initial reaction was filled with a bit more frustration, since what she believed was just a trip to retrieve some magic crystals ended up turning into a full-on war against the witch cult. So it was only natural she'd be a bit worried about Subaru. Ram was as passive-aggressive as ever, greeting Subaru with just as many insults as you might expect. When it came to Roswaal, he was weirdly happy to the point that Subaru thought he was planning something. In actuality, he was just content Amelia made it back, since she was after all crucial to his own plans. That said, as useless as Roswaal may seem not helping out with any of their endeavors, he was out doing things neither Subaru nor Amelia could do themselves. What those things are, we don't know, but it was clear Roswaal was very content watching Subaru from the sidelines, perhaps one day hoping to obtain proof of return by death. Roswaal would then probe into Anastasia a bit, curious to see if she would take responsibility for Amelia's hardships. Anastasia was fully prepared to apologize, but everyone seemed to agree the actions of the witch cult were their own. So even if it was Anastasia who brought Amelia into the city, it wasn't Anastasia who caused her to be attacked. Roswaal would then ask how she alone knew a secret path towards the tower, a fair question considering information like that was invaluable. Like, it didn't make sense for someone as money-driven as her not to sell that information. Aridina would just call it one of those things money couldn't buy, and that would be it for Roswaal's interrogation. In the end, he wouldn't be happy with Amelia choosing such a difficult path for herself, but at the same time he wasn't unhappy. If all this just meant Subaru would be challenging himself even further, then that was a path he would willingly let them walk. I mean, Subaru was after all the hope that served as a replacement for his Tome of Wisdom. It was then that Julius mistook Roswaal's caution for concern, so when he tried to alleviate it by saying it was all to save the others, Roswaal immediately questioned if it was actually Julius just wanting to save himself. There was nothing wrong if that was in fact the case, but to suggest it was for others, Roswaal didn't really like that. He had no issue calling out what could very well just be empty platitudes. Julius wasn't so bold as to deny Roswaal straight to his face, so instead it would be Anastasia to do it. Subaru was one step away from having an outburst himself, so that's where Roswaal decided to call it. All he wanted was to give everyone a bit of perspective. It's unclear whether Subaru was angry for Julius's sake or himself, but with the way Roswaal looked at him after, it was clear he saw right through him. Subaru's intent to save Rem couldn't have been very different from Julius's own intent to save himself, so the question then was it selfish to do so? Well, ever since his conversation with Aridina, Subaru had been feeling guilt. He felt guilty that he got to save himself from suffering before everyone else. It's that hesitation the anime doesn't really show us, and that then brings us to an even more emotional point. No one except for Roswaal was gonna complain about Subaru wanting to be happy. So, even if waking up Rem took all the attention away from her, Amelia knew all she needed to do was work harder to bring Subaru back to her side. Regardless of whether it was her, Rem, Beatrice, or anyone else, Amelia was intent on Subaru being happy with whoever he was with. This was all Subaru needed to hear for his hesitation to go away, so with her and Beatrice's support, he could now focus on Rem without worry. Next came a cutscene with just Beatrice and Roswaal, but on the off chance they decide to show it later, I'll refrain from talking about it in this episode. This brings us now to the melee scene, a conversation which would involve everyone. First, Aridina would immediately pick up on this miasma-like aura. She knew it wasn't exactly the same, but something about it felt extremely familiar. Now, with Melee playing with her dolls right before they entered, Amelia would make the mistake of commenting about it. Naturally, Melee would get all embarrassed, and that in turn made starting the conversation difficult. It had forced Subaru to use his trump card early, a stuffed animal he'd been working on the trip back here. This was a direct result of all of Subaru's hard work, specifically his drastically improved sewing skills. In fact, every toy Melee had was handcrafted by Subaru. To any random outsider, such a gesture would probably be seen as kindness, but to Julius, who knew Subaru's reputation, he definitely wasn't beating the allegations. Subaru would then fill Julius in on why Meili was being kept here, making note of her assassination attempts and her ability to control mob beasts. Normally, mob beasts weren't the type of creatures that could be tamed by people, but Meili's blessing allowed her to control them the same way their very own horns did. As for why she was being kept here now, aside from the risk of letting her go, if Mother found her, there was no doubt she'd kill her. So, in a way, keeping Meili here was for her own safety too. Why did the Amelia camp want to keep her safe? Well, that just came down to choice. There was no valid reason to not punish someone who they knew was a killer, but at the same time they couldn't bring themselves to properly take it out on her. In the end, it just came down to what they felt was right. Subaru knew his actions were contradictory to his beliefs, but for Meili, he and Amelia agreed to make an exception. Now, with Subaru's gift making Meili more talkative, 3 major problems would be identified by her. The first were the dens of mob beasts, which she technically could take care of. The second was the Desert of Illusion Aridina supposedly knew how to cross, then the third was the miasma. In the novel, that first problem was such an obstacle that after seeing Subaru struggle to come up with a solution for it, it was Meili herself that would offer to join them, not Subaru formally asking her. This was a suggestion he was completely okay with, since on the off chance it was just an excuse to escape, it's not like Meili was being forced to stay in the manor anyway. Sure, they may call her room a prison, but if there was ever a time when Meili wanted to leave, Subaru fully intended to let her do so. All he asked was that she at least write to them, a simple means of making sure she was doing okay. Such was concern that appealed to Meili in ways she never expected, causing her to see why Subaru was so favored by Beatrice and Petra now. With Anastasia and Julius being there too, Subaru definitely wasn't ever going to beat the allegations. Next came a whole cutscene with Petra, but due to the size of it, it'll probably be included next episode. That then brings us to the moment with Rem, the only place where Subaru could ever show his weakness. With Amelia, he only ever showed this unyielding courage ready to give his all to her, and with Beatrice, he only ever showed a trust tantamount to putting his life in her hands. When it came to the girl that was Rem though, she alone saw the weakness Subaru always kept hidden. So it was during this time that Subaru would often read to her from his journal, a log of everything he and the others got up to. He didn't want her to be left behind by those who cherished her. So, day after day, this is what Subaru had done, hoping one day he might actually be able to save her. Well, at long last that time had finally come, and though this breakthrough wasn't of his own effort, the path ahead definitely would be. The dangerous journey to the Watchtower was intended for Rem and Rem alone. Subaru fully acknowledged it as selfish, but just like how she had devoted herself to him once before, it was now his turn to do the same for her. So that's where episode 1 ends off, wrapping up what was quite a lot. Episode 68, Overcome Sandtime, covering chapters 2 and 3 from volume 21 of the light novel. Prior to the group's departure, there were a few cutscenes involving a lot of the side characters, one of which was Roswaal and Beatrice. They were having a discussion by themselves, Roswaal mocking Beatrice's switch to Subaru's side, and Beatrice countering with the fact her relationship with Subaru was far better than whatever relationship Roswaal had with Mother. More importantly than that though was the confirmation from both Subaru now had a second witch factor within him. Their discussion surrounding it was incredibly vague, but 2 lines in particular really stood out to me. The first was Beatrice saying how there should be other candidates aside from Subaru, and the second was Roswaal mentioning something about being overlapped. I couldn't tell you what any of it meant, but with Beatrice refusing to allow Subaru to gain any more witch factors, I'm assuming that caution stems from Subaru being at risk of losing his identity. Whatever that risk may be, so long as Beatrice was alive, Subaru would always be Subaru. After came a cutscene with Petra and Subaru, basically involving Petra complaining about how Subaru was going somewhere dangerous again. Her complaints were absolutely justified, but to Subaru, this was a job only he could do. Even if there was someone better suited for the job than him, Subaru wanted his face to be the first Rem saw when she woke up. With every fiber of his being, he wanted to be the one who saved her. So, knowing just how selfish and egotistical such a reason was, Subaru was ready for Petra to hate him forever. Instead, she would headbutt him right in the stomach, her way of telling him she understood. All she asked in return was that Subaru come back like he always did. So, it was then that Subaru would make her a promise. He would promise that she alone would always get the privilege of being the first one to welcome him back. This brings us now to where episode 2 begins, the final steps of preparation for their convoy. Now, the reason Subaru and Beatrice were placed on the side that needs protecting is because even with Beatrice, together their combat ability was only equal to Ram's. That's not to say that isn't still impressive, but when compared to the likes of Julius and Amelia, it was best to leave the serious fights to them. Surprisingly, Julius would be included in this conversation with Roswaal, mainly because Roswaal had seen enough to trust him. Not only that, without Roswaal even explaining anything, Julius had already assumed his concern for Ram was because of her constitution. It's then that Roswaal would actually go on to explain the specifics, but before I talk about that, it's likely they're saving that for a future episode. That being the case, if you don't want to know, skip ahead to here. Now, for those of you that do want to know, after having lost her horn, Ram's body can no longer contain all the power she was previously known to be so gifted with. That in turn afflicts her body with this constant state of pain, persistently straining it under the weight of that power. It's only because she's so strong that she does a good job of hiding it, but if you've ever wondered why she's so grumpy or why she can never help out with the chores properly, this is mainly the reason. So, in a way, Ram's condition is pretty similar to Subaru's, except where Subaru has Beatrice to regulate his defective gait, Ram always had Roswaal. It's the reason she privately visited Roswaal every night. Subaru just assumed that was something a bit more suggestive, but now that he knew what their secret meetings were really for, he was incredibly embarrassed by his misunderstanding. Now, the reason Julius was involved in this conversation at all is because Roswaal pegged him as the best substitute to regulate Ram-Zod. Doing so required someone who could manipulate multiple colors of magic, a talent Roswaal assumed Julius had due to all the spirits surrounding him. Well, as we saw in the anime, while those spirits did still hover around him, the connection granting him their power was severed. If not for that, he would have helped out Ram for sure. It's for that reason Amelia would have to step in his stead, Beatrice too, as her knowledge would prove invaluable. Together, both should be able to assist Ram the same way Roswaal did. It was then that Ram would show up with Rem, the latter now in a wheelchair Subaru personally helped recreate using memories from his old world. Of course, he wasn't skilled enough to build it by himself, but with the help of craftsmen from the industrial hub of Lagunica, a wheelchair like this was easy. Subaru wanted to be the one to push Rem himself, but that was a task Ram quickly made clear was hers. For Subaru, that was a bit disappointing, but with his two newly freed hands, they would both be held by Amelia and Beatrice instead. Both were quick to recognize Subaru's pain, so in a heartwarming moment, they would do what was necessary to comfort him. In fact, with Petra wanting to do the same and Rem one successful trip away from being awoken herself, Julius as a neutral observer put it best. When all was said and done though, it was an affectionate start to what would be at least a 2-month journey for them. Getting to the dunes took at least 20 days, a rather peaceful journey as the roads within Lagunica were safe. Still, Julius would be on watch while Subaru held the reins, an arrangement where the burden of reacting was on Julius. That didn't mean Subaru was allowed to lose focus either though, as a single yawn was enough to garner a warning from Julius. To him, a telegraphed opening such as that was something he wanted to avoid. In the meantime, the two would have that discussion about Julius and his spirits, then after came a lengthy discussion about Reinhardt. They both wondered who Reinhardt was before he was Reinhardt. Ever since Julius met Reinhardt back when they were 10 years old, in the 10 years since, Reinhardt hadn't changed a bit. The Reinhardt of today was the same fully developed, fully self-aware hero as the Reinhardt back then. So, despite Subaru and Julius both having their own worries on what they were and weren't capable of, they wondered if Reinhardt, this pinnacle to humanity, ever felt the same. He certainly didn't back when he was 10 years old, but perhaps prior to inheriting his grandmother's blessing at the young age of 5. Either way, to Julius, Reinhardt was the person he looked up to most. he hoped one day to embody even a portion of his character. Now, 3 days later, the group would arrive in Mirula, the self-proclaimed easternmost town in the world. Here they would arrive at that tavern, and in that tavern, Subaru would finally learn what miasma was. In short, miasma was just the word for mana polluted by something bad. The reason this was such a roadblock is because, just like breathing, mana is naturally absorbed by the body through a person's gait. If one is surrounded by an environment where that mana is tainted, then over time your body would react negatively as if taking in poison gas. Small amounts of miasma were generally okay, but when it came to the miasma here, this was about as dense as it got anywhere in the world. That being the case, prolonged exposure to it would undoubtedly cause your heart and body to be swallowed up by the pollution of it. What happened then? Well, apparently you just go crazy. Your heart and body deteriorate to the point you're not yourself anymore. This brings us now to a cutscene with the dragons, specifically the moment Joseph was added to the party. He was swapped in only after they arrived at Mirula, mainly due to his species being far better suited for sandstorms. Patrash was a Diana dragon herself, so that meant she performed well in every environment. She was a breed said to be a descendant of the first dragon. Even if she wasn't though, there was no way she would be left behind no matter how hard Subaru tried. Reason being that the incident in Pristella left her upset. Just like every other woman in Subaru's life, she didn't like not being relied on when Subaru needed help most. So after being locked away for the entire conflict in Pristella, for a short time after, Patrash would refuse to interact with Subaru. It wasn't until Otto intervened to explain why that Subaru finally understood Patrash just wanted to protect him. Patrash wasn't the only one trying to be gallant, as Subaru too wanted to look out for Ram. You see, after 20 days, it was clear Beatrice and Amelia's treatment wasn't enough, so Subaru was always making sure she wasn't exerting herself. Of course, Ram was a bit embarrassed she was the cause of so much worry, but at the same time, she refused to let herself be a hindrance. Whether out of fear of being left behind or simply wanting to do her part, Ram was fully committed to seeing this through. It was then that Amelia and Ram would share a rare moment together, Ram noticing how Amelia acted a lot more confident, while Amelia happy Ram could act more comfortable around her. Before, she was always envious that Subaru got to see Ram's true personality, but on this trip, she got to experience it too. So it seems the two of them were becoming a little bit closer. Finally, the group would arrive at their very first obstacle, crossing the desert during sand time. This wasn't a random occurrence like how you may think, but rather a phenomenon occurring 3 times daily. Once in the morning, once midday, then once in the middle of the night. These weren't your typical sandstorms either, as the miasma infused with it meant they were essentially traversing a toxic waste dump. Fun fact, that's actually why the desert is a desert in the first place. It's not the climate or geography that makes this place covered in sand, it's the miasma killing any and all foliage. So, unlike the arid deserts we know, the desert here had rain and wasn't even hot. It simply flowed with toxic poison. Now, the longest sand time always happened at night, so it was the right call to hunker down like how we saw in the anime. Meili's powers kept them safe while she slept as well, so that was another problem they didn't have to worry about. The only problem left then was the miasma. Based on how people were starting to talk less to each other, it was clear it was starting to cause fatigue and weariness. Not only that, there was a possibility the warped space not letting them get anywhere was a natural trap caused by the miasma. Perhaps like a bottomless swamp or the mirages you see in a real desert, this could be something similar. A naturally occurring threat to life that whoever built the tower just decided to take advantage of. The watchtower was, after all, meant to keep surveillance over the place where the Witch of Envy was sealed, so the question then was which came first, the watchtower or the trap? If it was the trap, that meant it wasn't made by humans, and something natural like that might not even have an answer on how to overcome it. In the end, Ram would be the only person who could find that answer, so despite being in extraordinary pain, she would lend her services anyway. This would actually turn out to be a multi-day endeavor, since not only did it require a lot of trial and error, the only times they could try was during one of the 3 sand times. 3 days was how long it took for them to finally reach a breakthrough, the bird switch would lead them directly out of the sand time. You see, it wasn't natural for a bird like this to exist in such a harsh environment, so the only way it could possibly survive here is if there was some sort of secret. That was the reasoning for his choice to follow it, and sure enough, that secret was a hidden garden of sorts. Now, those flowers were actually parasites feeding off whatever creature the Oiran bears were, since while they definitely had the silhouette of a bear, whatever lay underneath wasn't. You see, with the way the roots of the flower extended all the way around the creature's body, that merely gave it the form of a bear. The sunken eyes underneath made it clear that this was more like a walking corpse. What happened next was exactly as we saw in the anime, Joseph triggering a stampede of bears, the group fending them off with an impressive display of teamwork, then a flash of light vaporizing Subaru's head instantly. No one was able to call out what happened or even react, as everyone who saw it got vaporized the exact same way, the dragons included. So, in only a mere instant, multiple flashes of light had wiped out their party just like that. Of course, Subaru only bore witness to his, but that was the fate of the group in this loop. In the end, nothing remained but sand. Now, this type of death was rather unique, as when it came to after, usually Subaru would feel either pain, shock, or fear. Sometimes it was an intense pain that made him want to cry, other times it was a blood-curdling shock, then finally there was the terror of losing everything. This time, however, Subaru felt none of that, instead realizing this was more of a kind death. It had happened so fast that he wasn't even able to perceive it. It was as if he just blinked then returned to the past. For Subaru, it wasn't so much the fact he died that was bothering him, but rather the fact his checkpoint was here. He was bothered by how little time to respond he now had. Then, with the way everything repeated the exact same way it happened before, this to Subaru was the first time he'd experienced a reset he'd call a waste. Sure, there were plenty of times where he'd died failing to learn anything new from the previous loop, but this was the first time he'd found himself incapable of doing anything different. As they were now, they were on track to repeating the very same mistake they made the first time, all without having the opportunity to learn anything new. So, with very little room to maneuver at all, Subaru was worried his ability to return by death might have just been backed into a corner. Regret overwhelmed him as he knew no value was to be gained from his previous loop. Still, he would try to make the most out of it anyway, but as we saw, the outcome was unsurprisingly the same. Patrash's effort would be nothing more than a futile attempt to block the unblockable, merely prolonging what would have been quick and painless. Beatrice would then do all she could to support Subaru's limp body, while Subaru would do all he could to try and comfort her. When nothing of his physical body worked, instead, Subaru drew on something that wasn't part of his body. That's right, despite knowing this loop was over, Subaru would still use every bit of his remaining energy to use an invisible hand to wipe Beatrice's tears away. The second shot merely put Beatrice out of her misery first, while whatever remained of Subaru was left to the maw beasts. Subaru wasn't sure whether it was them that dealt the final blow or something else, but what he did know was his brain couldn't comprehend anything anymore. It was that confusion that he would quickly have to overcome, ultimately leading to the move which would save them. Subaru wasn't sure what the cost of doing so would be, but in the moment he activated his power, something inside him felt like it was being torn away. It was a far different feeling from all the other times he'd used it. Normally, the invisible hand would bring with it the intense feeling of having lost half his body, but for some reason what he felt here was nothing. If anything, he was just breathing a little heavier. It's not like that was necessarily a good thing though, since there was no benefit in getting used to a power that was undoubtedly harming himself. This, however, wasn't the time to figure that out, so instead the group would fall back for a meeting. They would commend Meili for her efforts in the field, then ask if anything could be done about the bears. If there were less than 100, she definitely could, but for a garden of this size, she sensed there were more. Perhaps thousands or even tens of thousands. So, to continue forward, that meant she'd have to focus on the more immediate bears, moving only those in front, then hoping it wouldn't disturb any of the other ones. Further discussions about the sand time revealed it was similar in nature to Beatrice's passage, making it a distortion in space that could spit out those who traverse it anywhere. Finally came the talk about the light, the truth of which Subaru would have to skirt without revealing how he came about it. Remember, anything even hinting at return by death was taboo. So, Subaru would have to chalk his warning up to instinct, a message Ram would be surprisingly acceptive of. Reason being that this to her was the natural development of those lucky enough to survive as many dire situations as Subaru. Just as a field rat knows to change its den before the rain comes, Subaru seemed to pick up on danger before it actually struck. Then, as if Subaru was being targeted by a sniper, a red dot akin to a laser pointer would appear right on his chest. The next instant, a flash of light would come barreling towards him, except this time the others would be there to help him. Amelia would create a chestplate device to block the initial impact, then Julius would intercept it right as it was about to penetrate that chestplate. The chestplate wasn't even enough to delay the attack for a complete second, yet still Julius was able to react fast enough. In fact, with the way they showed it go down in the anime, this has gotta be one of my favorite scenes with Julius. Perhaps even better than a lot of scenes with Reinhardt. The fact Julius is a normal person makes the feat even more impressive, so perhaps he's a bit stronger than we think he is. In any case, with one layer of ice not being enough, Amelia's next defense would consist of 6. Again, the needle would break through, but now it was slow enough for Julius to intercept without difficulty. It also gave Subaru time to activate EMT, so the third attack was no faster than a simple arrow. This gave Ram the opportunity to sync with whoever the attacker was, confirming the target was in fact Subaru. Moments later, the world beneath them would crack, and their fall into darkness is what would wrap up the episode. Episode 69, The Keeper of the Watchtower, covering chapters 4 and 5 from volume 21 of the light novel. Here we are, down in the caves beneath the dunes, Subaru with Ram, Aridina, and Patrash. I'm sure there might be a bit more to it, but Subaru's reasoning for grabbing Ram was purely instinctual. He had reflexively grabbed onto her over anyone else. Now, if you're wondering why Ram didn't just use clairvoyance to check on the locations of everyone else, that's because her wavelength didn't overlap with any of the others. Well, there was at least one, but to connect with her would be useless. Besides, if anyone was even close to begin with, they probably would have tried to meet up already. Other than Meili, no one really had any reason to try and avoid the group. Subaru was fairly certain she wouldn't try to escape like that, but as a girl who tried to kill them once already, Ram was justifiably a bit more skeptical. In any case, with the truth of the miasma having already been explained back at the tavern, the heaviness of the air indicated they were in an area filled with it. So, unlike how in the anime the miasma wasn't revealed till after the first loop, Subaru was already well aware they were somewhere incredibly dangerous. Now, while it was true this wasn't the most ideal party, Aridina privately told Subaru that she would use magic if she had to. Of course, she didn't want to shave away at Anastasia's life, but if push came to shove, she would do what was necessary. It's for that reason she had high hopes in Subaru. So, in the novel, Subaru would be relegated to the position of foot servant, while Ram and Aridina both got to ride on Patrash. Walking in sand really went to sap his endurance though, so multiple breaks needed to be taken. It was during them that Ram would continue her search with clairvoyance, and Subaru would reflect on just how awful he'd been. He of all people should have known just how devoted Ram was to her sister, since this past year she'd been the one taking care of her. Despite not even remembering any part of her, day after day Ram was the one who was there for her. So, to question that devotion even after seeing it every day for a year was a pretty big oversight. Aridina's words did help him feel a little bit better, but considering how these were the same tactics Echidna used to ensnare him before, Subaru couldn't help but remain wary of her. Aridina wished Subaru would see the two of them as separate entities, but for him, that was probably gonna take some time. Now, it was deeper into the cave they went that unease and anxiety started to grow. Not only that, the lack of mob beasts was pretty disturbing. This could very well have been a mob beast den, yet for some reason not a single one showed itself. Ram couldn't even find one with her clairvoyance. This led them to believe perhaps they were shut off from the world, stuck in a rift of space not connected to anywhere. They were, however, following the faintest breath of wind, so if that was the case, that shouldn't have been possible. It's then that the group would stumble upon a crossroads, Subaru using the teachings of Zhuge Liang to pick a direction. I know the anime decided to use Sigmund Freud, but here in the novel it was the 2nd century Chinese strategist. In a way, this crossroads did come as a kind of relief though, since it confirmed for everyone they weren't stuck in a loop. On the other hand, it did make the sage seem more scary than they already were. If this was yet another of their traps, then sinister would be the only way to describe them. it led Ram to wonder whether the sage would even answer their questions. If the sage went this far as to keep visitors out, then Ram felt she might have to resort to more persuasive methods to get her answers. It was once at the door soon after that a proper discussion would be had about turning back, reason being that if a passage was blocked, it must be blocked for a reason. Given how every metaphorical roadblock was to make the path to the tower a lot more difficult though, it was hard to believe this passage was anything other than a direct path to the tower. So, for everyone, forward was the only answer. Eventually, the miasma would start to chip away at them, heavying their mood and body in a way that made it clear they weren't supposed to be there. The only reason they kept moving forward regardless is because Subaru believed doing so would lead them to everyone else. He kept telling himself the miasma was going to go away. He forced himself to believe Amelia and the others were waiting up ahead for him. The novel does an excellent job conveying just how heavy the weight of the miasma becomes, hinting here and there the way it was changing them. The anime does an even better job portraying it, but if you're wondering how long they were walking before they lost it, according to Subaru, it was something like hours. Well, actually it was only Subaru walking, so when the dead end was reached and Ram made her comments about it, Subaru perceived that as disrespect coming from someone who wasn't doing any work. Like, it was easy for her to talk while not having to trudge through sand the same way Subaru was. Subaru believed this to be Ram looking down on him, so when she started saying all that stuff about Ram, that's when Subaru gave in to the dark feelings eating away at him. All he did though was drag her off Patrash and throw her into the dirt, not punch her with an impact that would rupture her organs. The ensuing fight would then happen exactly as we saw it, the only thing missing a few extra insults from Ram. Surprisingly, Subaru would actually feel confident in his matchup against her, thinking his whip would be faster than Ram's ability to activate her magic. So, with speed alone, Subaru was ready to gouge Ram's face out. He was determined to make it so no one else in the world looked like Ram. As we saw, Aridina would beat him to it, then the reason Subaru didn't lash out at her next is because, unlike Ram, she was still useful. Subaru was of sound enough mind to understand Aridina was still his guide to the watchtower. He would still be hesitant anyway though, unsure whether shaking Aridina's hand was the best idea. She was after all wielding a knife, and to enter into handshake range would conveniently make his own weapon useless. That being the case, it was these two factors that would lead Subaru to the conclusion Aridina needed to die too. Not only that, he was ready to snap her neck in order to avoid making the same mistake he made with Ram. Yet again, Subaru would miss the opportunity though, surprised instead by you-know-what. The gore was shockingly on par with the way it was described in the novel, only missing Aridina's lower half soiling itself. It is worth noting this was a wound Aridina should have died immediately to, so the fact she didn't really made Subaru question his sanity. Like, for a person who just got cut in half, her grip remained pretty strong regardless. Now, in the anime, the scene with Patrash would come next, but what happened first was another face-off with Ram. She was still alive somehow, slowly stumbling towards him with whatever energy she had left. It was clear she was intent on finishing him off the same way she did to Aridina. It was in all the prior chaos that Subaru had lost his whip though, so with no other means to defend himself, he would choose to rely on invisible providence again. The thing is, after using it twice already, the third was far too much for him. A searing pain overwhelmed his eye like a needle was being pushed straight through it. Tears of blood would erupt from them next, the agony causing him to roll on the floor all in Aridina's guts. This would be the moment Ram would ready herself to deliver the finishing blow, up until Patrash would beat her to it. Again, the anime does a fantastic job depicting just how gruesome this all was, so with that happening pretty much the same, only two things need to be added. The first is Subaru's realization his negative emotions were being amplified to a scary degree, then the second came right after Patrash had killed him. For some reason, despite having lost his head, Subaru could still hear the sound of his body being chewed at. His head was shattered and his ears no more, yet somehow the sound of Patrash feasting on his flesh was still audible to him. It was a weird sensation he couldn't make any sense out of. In the end, Subaru would die at the jaws of his very own partner, his consciousness absorbing the feeling long after what should have been possible. It was when that consciousness finally resurfaced again that it wasn't his death which affected him like this. No, it was the visceral deaths of everyone else. His death was something he was very well versed in, but when it came to the deaths of those close to him, that really tore away at him, especially when they were as gruesome as these. So, Subaru would vomit at the thought of Ram's previous fate, forcing Ram to have to baby him. It did make Subaru feel a whole lot better, but what didn't was the way Ram mocked him for having to treat him this way. As thoughtful of a gesture as this was, it appeared Ram found great pleasure in getting to treat Subaru like an infant, or at least tease him for acting like one. This confirmed things were back to normal, so it was during this time that Subaru would take the opportunity to explain things. He wanted Ram to know why it was he decided to grab her. With that clearly being a point of contention from the last loop, Subaru felt it was best to be honest. So the reason he did is because he was already holding on to her when the world started to shatter. Not only that, it was in that moment that she was both the closest and the weakest. He wasn't trying to weigh her against anyone else. It truly was just him reacting reflexively. Now, perhaps Subaru didn't need to explain himself at all, but he was sure there was some truth behind their outbursts in the last loop. Sure, their rage was definitely influenced by the miasma, but to think that was the only reason for it was foolish. So, Ram would accept his explanation the only way she knew how, abusing Subaru both verbally and physically. Her words would serve to remind him of what was really important though, so the only thing they could do was keep going forward. It was when Patrash and Anastasia showed up after that the sight of his killer would shock Subaru a bit. Her actions in the last loop had left quite the scar on him. This wouldn't be the first time this happened though, so when compared to the way Rem and Ram tried to kill him, Patrash's involuntary manslaughter wasn't really anything. All he needed was time to process it. I couldn't tell you whether he was going about the right way of doing so, but in his own words, he would call his pain and sense of loss fake. To him, they were figments of his imagination that he decided weren't real. That probably wasn't the healthiest way to go about it, but for now, it was the only mindset that would help him overcome the fear he was feeling. A mindset Patrash would look upon with concern in her eyes. Now, Subaru's own concern wasn't in an attempt to detect the miasma's influence early, it was simply out of consideration for the companions he watched die only moments ago. He was genuinely worried for these people he cared about. It's not like he could straight up tell them how important they were though, as even without saying anything, Ram would call him a pervert anyway. At the crossroads, Subaru would do a terrible job justifying his decision, but what he did do was make clear Zhuge Liang was not to be trusted. His desperation would ultimately get the others to go along with him, so as they traversed down the unexplored left path, Subaru would contemplate the situation he was in. He was bothered by how quickly his save point changed, since if anything happened to those he was separated from, he wouldn't be able to use his own life to save them. It was a terrifying thought that brought flashbacks to the whole Rem situation. Nothing scared him more than a loss he wasn't able to fix. So, it was as Subaru prayed for their safety that eventually he would stumble upon this Dark Souls boss arena. What Subaru would see first wasn't Fulgore, champion of Nightglow, it was instead another Oiran bear. Subaru would be stuck trying to decide between fight or flight long enough for the bear to charge at him. It was right as it did though that a spear and subsequent flames would vaporize it instantly. The ensuing encounter would then become the most rushed part of the episode, as before Ram and Patrash would jump in to save Subaru, he would first make multiple notable observations. The first was that this was a mob-beast crematorium, another trap just like the miasma, the Garden of Oiran bears, and the sandstorms. His next observation came after standing only a few feet away from the centaur, attempting to hide his presence while standing right out in the open. A less experienced Subaru might have resigned himself to death, but the Subaru here had long forgotten the standard practice of being hopelessly killed by enemies far more powerful than him. If you think return by death is still his only method of fighting back, that would be to grossly underestimate him. That's right, Subaru had died far too many times to let himself fall like this. So when the centaur approached Subaru's direction but never attacked, Subaru quickly deduced it wasn't sure of his presence anymore. A few more observations later, and Subaru would come to the conclusion his opponent could neither smell nor see. Now, if this centaur was a mob beast that lived underground, then it wasn't impossible for it to have evolved to lose its vision over time, instead relying solely on sound. Subaru would then confirm this by throwing his water bottle, the impact of which would send the centaur charging right at it. This showed everyone what the centaur's peculiarity was, making it clear to even Ram and Aridina. It's the reason we see them not say anything here. No words were needed for Subaru to understand Ram wanted him to retreat, but in Subaru's mind this was a golden opportunity. To him, the odds of falling into this pit in the exact same way that a bear would distract the centaur was unlikely. So, if this was the only time Subaru might get to limit test, he decided he would make the most out of it. He would use his coins to send the centaur running in one direction, then use that distraction as an opportunity to run the opposite way. It was right as he was about to make a break for it though that Ram would take him, herself, and Anastasia all hostage. If Subaru wasn't gonna listen and retreat like how she wanted him to, then with her wand in hand, she was ready to attract the centaur to all of them. Immediately, Subaru understood this was Ram acting out of concern for him, so before he could do anything too reckless, he would decide to retreat. By then, the centaur's attention was back on him though, so Subaru would try to mask his steps with the sound of even more coins. That, however, didn't work for long, as despite Subaru not making a sound, the centaur seemed to always lock back in on him. It was then that everyone realized this centaur had echolocation. Every time it opened its mouth to roar, that was it getting a vivid look at its surroundings. So at this point, Subaru had no choice but to run for his life, even using his whip to swing around its body in a circle. It didn't take long for the centaur to knock Subaru off, after which its cry would turn into a laugh. That's right, this small beast was intelligent enough to know it was toying with Subaru. That's when Subaru would resort to the only tool he had left, his invisible providence, which he knew guaranteed him at least one free hit. Well, activating it was no problem, but the instant he was about to attack with it, an unimaginably intense pain rocked his head all the way through. I couldn't tell you why that is, but the centaur wasn't gonna wait for Subaru to recover. So, right as Subaru was about to be incinerated, Patrash would jump in and tear the centaur's arm off. She would then grab Subaru and run away with him, dodging the ensuing attacks to the best of her ability. Subaru, still writhing in unimaginable pain, would be spurred into action by one single line from Ram. Knowing the one girl who needed him most was still waiting for him, that led him to push through the pain. It allowed him to activate Invisible Providence again, despite his body doing everything it could to prevent it. It lasted just long enough to deflect the centaur's spear, but at the same time caused him even more pain. In the end, the outcome would be just as we saw, and Ram and Subaru would get saved by the Mystery Lady. Episode 70, A White Sky Asterism, covering Chapter 5 from Volume 21 of the light novel and Chapters 1 to 2 from Volume 22. If we pick things up right from when Shala showed herself, there was a very cool scene involving her and the mob beast that didn't make it into the anime. Just like how the centaur's echolocation wasn't revealed with Subaru's extensive experimentation, so too was its ability to adapt. And I'm not just talking the ability to adapt like the way someone such as Subaru might, I'm talking the insane power akin to that of Maharaga from Jujutsu Kaisen. Yeah, this random mob beast chilling in its own boss arena, it's probably one of the most fearsome creatures Subaru has ever come across. So, after Shala's initial attack had blown away half the centaur's upper body, the centaur fully adapted and evolved to counter it. It went from 2 arms to 4, 4 legs to 8, hardened its entire body with flame-resistant armor, then equipped itself with a sword, lance, hammer, and axe. Though it didn't fully understand the opponent it was now up against, it seemed to try and prepare itself for anything. Well, Shala just upped her firepower instead, then unleashed all of it until nothing of the centaur remained. With not even a single speck of dust remaining, there was nothing left for the centaur to regenerate from. So this, if anything, just went to show how powerful Shala was. Now, it's here we enter into what could only be Subaru's subconscious, a place where 2 other unnatural consciousnesses currently resided. This would be the first time Subaru's own consciousness would bear witness to them, but with the way he was now, he didn't have the ability to understand them. He felt he could if he really wanted to, but for some reason, he decided not to. He found no need to give them any attention. Well, turns out Subaru could actually just turn them off, just like how we saw him do in the anime. What came after was the scene with who I assume is Satella, her figure here being more distinct and clear than any of Subaru's other encounters with her. Now he could actually see what it was she was wearing, and the only hidden part left was her face. for Subaru, not seeing it was genuinely frustrating, but there was a certain satisfaction that came with being so close to her. He felt someday he'd be able to touch her hands for real, and it was when that day came that he'd be sure to express his love for her. If there was one emotion he felt more strongly than anything here, it was to reciprocate the love whoever this was giving him now. So, that to me is both confusing and revealing, since it's the first time Subaru's actually expressed any emotional comfort with this shadow. It's different from the time he met Satella back in the tomb, but if this is even her to begin with, then perhaps Subaru's subconscious has become a bit more comfortable with her. When it came to him waking up after, Subaru had a theory that how easily you fell asleep was inversely related with how easily you woke up. So, if you were someone who fell asleep fast, then that meant you were also someone who took a long time to wake up. Well, Subaru was the opposite, and that's because regrets filled his head whenever he tried falling asleep. His mind would always drift to situations he could have resolved better, and that, as a result, made his sleeps worse and shorter. These recent events in the labyrinth certainly didn't help either, so that would only serve to disrupt his sleep even more in the future. Now, after Beatrice confirmed by name everyone was present and accounted for, there would be a moment where Shala would closely appraise Subaru, then softly mutter the word 3. I couldn't tell you for sure what that meant, but if I had to guess, I would say it was Subaru's true number of witch factors. With Regulus and Betelgeuse both being in the same plane of existence as Satella, that could very well indicate that she's the representative of the Envy witch factor. I could just be completely off, but maybe that's why Subaru was able to open 3 doors as well. Maybe each were locked behind the possession of a single witch factor. Either way, Shala clearly knows something that Subaru doesn't. Their whole scuffle would then bring us to the end of Volume 21, the novel tying things up with this. The options unchosen disappeared and the answers selected remained as the test began. It's pretty much a fancy way of saying Subaru's path was now set. So, as the group reconvened and discussed their circumstances, Subaru would express his concern for the 2 party members that were missing, then Meili would hint at the stress Subaru's separation had caused. Beatrice was on the verge of tears while Amelia was straight up panicking. We don't know what they or any of the others went through, but we can only assume it was much easier than whatever Subaru went through. Now, Subaru would go on to try and thank Ram for being so gallant, but the more he talked about it, the more frustrated she seemed to get. Well, turns out she was actually just embarrassed, and that's because Subaru was holding her when she woke up. They had actually showed how it was in ReZero break time, so I can imagine how waking up like this would be devastating for Ram. In any case, while they were both unconscious after their bout with the Centaur, that left Aridina as the only person to negotiate with Shala. Negotiate isn't really that accurate of a term though, since no matter how Aridina prodded, Shala wouldn't say anything. It's here with Subaru that she was an open book though, and every now and then she would say something oddly familiar. Not familiar to say Amelia or Julius, but incredibly familiar to Subaru. Like, take for example this moment after she was flicked on the forehead by Subaru. Her response to that was something along the lines of this. Now, I don't think suing was something you could even do in this world, so how then did Shala know that phrase to begin with? She would even use lines like false charges and innocent until proven guilty. Those were more in response to the stories that had propagated about her, mainly her achievements that supposedly passed on for generations. Those definitely weren't done by her though, so unless there was another Shala her master decided to name somewhere, the stories about her were definitely false. When Aridina tried to clear things up by using her coins, she had actually included one extra. There was the sacred gold coin depicting the dragon, the regular gold coin with the sword saint, the silver coin featuring the sage, then a copper coin with the Gunica castle. Every country worthy of their name always had its legacy etched into their currency. When it came to differentiating Subaru from the sage on the coin, for some reason Shala couldn't. This I found incredibly peculiar as, according to her, all people looked the same. She could just barely distinguish between a guy and a girl, but if 2 people both possessed hair, 2 eyes, 2 ears, a mouth and a nose, to her, they might as well be the same person. Size was really the only distinguishing factor she looked out for. So, whether that's due to the fact she's been stuck in this tower for 400 years, or perhaps something relating to her existence that's fundamentally different, Shala clearly isn't a regular person like the rest of them. Definitely not human considering the way she referred to Sword Saint Reed as one. Now, it's after the big reveal of the name Flugel that the long journey upward would commence for everyone. The next floor was only a few dozen yards up, but the spiral staircase made it so it was miles. It's for this reason Meili had to be carried since such a long walk for her was tiring. Shala had even offered to carry Subaru too, but Subaru's pride as a man wouldn't allow him to accept. No, instead he knew he could just ask Julius. It was during this walk that more discussions would be had on this Flugel character, first with Meili wondering about this great Flugel tree. She had actually expressed interest in wanting to see it, but Subaru had to let her know he was the one who cut it down. Interestingly enough though, it was back then that Subaru remembered someone calling Flugel a sage too, so now he started to wonder what this sage's accomplishments actually were. He did supposedly seal the witch together with his comrades, but other than that, no one could accurately say what it was he was famous for. So, with a lot of his accomplishments remaining unknown, perhaps this Flugel wasn't deserving of the sage title at all. Perhaps he was just good at trumpeting his achievements like how Subaru was. The most likely explanation was that Flugel just pinned all his achievements on Shala, thus her name being remembered instead of his. It was a theory Shala pretty much confirmed after mentioning how he didn't like to stand out too much. If that was in fact the case though, then the question on Subaru's mind was, how did his name get passed down in the first place? Well, according to a book Julius once read, it was all because Flugel carved his name into the tree. More specifically, his exact words were "Flugel was here." This was a choice Subaru couldn't help but view as idiotic, but at the same time fully acknowledged as something he would do. So it was after that that the name Flugel took on a life of its own. He would become this figure shrouded in mystery no one knew the origin of. It was once the group had finally made it to the door that Julius would reveal the other side of it was where he and the others spawned in. Opening them from his side didn't work though, so to make it through, they had to wait for Shala to open it. After a bit more walking, the group would finally make it to the spirit room, a place where only a limited number of people could enter at a time. That seemed to be the intention of the spirit who owned it, so it's for that reason everyone aside from Ram and Subaru would enter. Fun fact, the spirit was actually the room itself, an area so dense with mana that all this foliage could grow despite the miasma. Now, despite Ram mentioning that the spirit had no will of its own, occasionally it would make gestures that made it seem like it did. Like the moment Ram moved beside Rem to look over her, the vines of the tree twisted into the shape of a chair for her to sit in. Who knows whether that's actually the spirit reacting, but at the very least those manners were appreciated. Why the spirit didn't make a chair for Subaru though? Well, Ram suggested it had something to do with hierarchies. But anyway, after a little teasing of Ram's efforts to come all the way downstairs just to see him, he would then regroup with the others to discuss what's next. Here he would get more info about the watchtower, mainly some details about its layout. Where Subaru came in from was the 6th floor as Therapy, the entrance was on the 5th floor Seleno, the 4th floor was Shala's lair Alcyone, the 3rd the examination hall Taigada, the 2nd Electra, and the 1st Maya. How they all entered was by undoing the tower's dimension gate, the name of the trap that caused space to warp around them. Had the gate not been undone, then Shala told everyone she would have just kept firing at them. This then brought into question quite the interesting topic, since where Shala made it sound like Subaru wouldn't have died had he been hit by it, Meili knew for sure he would have. So, when she asked Shala what she would have done had she killed Subaru, Shala simply laughed in confusion. To her, nothing so minor could ever kill her master. In fact, Shala wasn't sure whether her master was even capable of dying. That was the one trait that made her master who he was, since if her master did die, they wouldn't be her master to begin with. That Shala was 100% certain of. It's a comment that could very well be pointing at return by death. Now, despite Shala having killed him twice anyway, surprisingly Subaru felt no anger towards her. No, if anything, him dying by her hands was more like a traffic accident. So, rather than hate this person who killed him unintentionally, what he really felt was a mix of forgiveness and resignation. Back to the layout of the tower, with the 6 floors being identified as what I mentioned earlier, Subaru would wonder where Merope was. I'm sure you probably figured out the floors of the Pleiades watchtower were named after the Pleiades star cluster, so with Merope being the seventh of the seven sisters, Subaru was curious as to why it was excluded. This will probably be mentioned later, but as it turns out, there's actually a quote-unquote zeroth floor, a place created after Flugel had disappeared. You'd think this floor would be above the first, but with the way Shala neglected to call the sixth floor the lowest, that made Subaru believe it was underground. It was at this point that Shala refused to share anything else, as according to her, the requirements hadn't been fulfilled yet. Apparently, this was Subaru still in the middle of his journey, so talk about the zeroth floor was currently forbidden. The whole thing had led to a strange change in tone from Shala. Up until now, she was very responsive, yet all of a sudden she was defensive, almost threatening. So whatever Subaru had said which caused this wall to go up, he knew he needed to drop it. For now, he at least knew for sure Flugel was the same as him, a person from another world just like Al and Hoshin. Subaru then wondered from what time did Flugel come and how did he live, but what came first was the examination. A test the novel seemingly makes an effort to emphasize has three key categories. That would be time, attempts, and challengers, all of which were set to unlimited. That probably means there's more tests the further they go up, so I'm assuming those numbers are likely to change. When it came to this test, the voice declaring the hint wasn't actually a voice at all. It wasn't sound that reached Subaru's ears, but rather a whisper directly into his brain. In fact, to Subaru, it almost sounded like the voice in his head when he read to himself. Now, there were a couple additional interactions during their deliberation, the first of which was a comment from Shala. While Subaru was teasing the way she was dressed, Shala would mention that this was an outfit her mother chose for her. Whether that mother is human is a completely different question, but as of now, that's what Shala is making it seem like. Meili would then mention how she wanted to go home, finally fed up with the adventure they were on. She was still committed to helping them resolve their problem, but the sooner they got out, the better. It was when Julius commented on Reed after that his reasoning for such a glowing image was due to the way his stories were passed down. You see, his upstanding character wasn't just an assumption on Julius's part, they were a core part of the Estrella family's lineage. So, for any of it to not be true, that would imply the Estrella family's history was twisted. Well, twisted it was, and the revelation of such would be far too much for Julius. It was safe to say he wouldn't be of much use for a while. Getting back to the test at hand, Subaru was starting to feel like this was a trial. With the way the test started and the way the number of floors implied that there were 3, Subaru couldn't help but get the feeling Echidna was messing with him all over again. This naturally left a sour taste in his mouth since at the end of the day, both he and Amelia considered her this. Amelia tended to put it a little bit nicer, but for Subaru, that was exactly how he felt. So, given the similarities between this and the trials at the tomb, it wasn't far-fetched to think the sage and the witches were connected. It was after this that Subaru would come to the conclusion we saw in the anime. The hero destroyed by Shala was Orion. It was a star-based puzzle requiring a star-based solution. The rest was as we saw, so next episode we'll get deeper into the library. Episode 71, Stick Swinger, covering chapters 3 and 4 from volume 22 of the light novel. With the third floor Teijida now unlocked, Subaru could only rant about how impossible the test would be for anyone else. That much we saw for ourselves, but in an interesting statement Shala would make after, Subaru should have been happy the constellation test was at least solvable. Had the test been given by someone like Reed, then Shala didn't put it past him to leave a clone of himself and not let anyone through unless they could beat him. That to her was what she would consider impossible. So, with knowledge of a different universe seeming like the least of Subaru's problems, he could only move on and focus on the task in front of him. The archive of books Beatrice couldn't be happier to be in. Not because this was a place where she spent 400 years of her life, but rather because it was where Subaru told her to choose him. A library such as this wasn't a place Beatrice could forget no matter how hard she tried. Now, there was no denying it was Subaru who had gotten all of them to the point they were now, so naturally such a feat was deserving of praise. Amelia would display it with blind faith and absolute trust, Beatrice with her loving affection, then even Julius with his modest sincerity. They were all things Subaru once yearned to attain for himself. It was now that he actually had them, though, that the sense something was wrong kept bothering him. For some reason, he just couldn't be content with the way things were. Sure, these people close to him now saw him the exact way he wanted them to, but Subaru was now doubting whether he actually deserved that. He wondered if he was truly worthy of all their respect like that. Now, their deliberation of the books would continue just as we saw, then it's once we get to the story of Tufon that can pretty much be summed up like this. In a world where there's an infinite multitude of possibilities, every action can be judged into two categories: deeds that were just and deeds that were wrong. Not many would consider such in the black and white way that Tufon does, but it was her curious upbringing that made it so. You see, while her father's intent was certainly a noble one, the instillment of his ideals was done far too hastily. Tufon had grown up watching so many people be executed that she sooner learned the appropriate punishment for sins than she did the sanctity of life. So, with only an understanding that sinners needed to be punished, what Tufon sought was a scale by which she could judge evil deeds as evil. Crime and punishment were influenced by many different factors though, so for this girl who knew nothing of compromise or resignation, Tufon struggled to find an answer for herself. It was only after her father accepted her crime without punishment that's when Tufon found her scale. If a sin worthy of being punished existed within a person's heart, they would be judged accordingly. Such was how the Witch of Pride came to be. This was the story Subaru was bearing witness to, not with his mind, his head, or his body, but rather with his very soul itself. That's right, his soul was what was pulled into this book, and it was his soul that Subaru was struggling to tear back out of it. This meant Subaru got to experience everything the same way Tufon did, everything from the smell and taste of the blood, all the way to the feeling and weight of countless lives shattered. So, vicariously does well to describe that sensation, as Subaru essentially experienced Tufon's life the same way she did. Julius had done the same with Belleroy, but what they didn't show after was his hesitation in talking about it. At first, Julius was reluctant to reveal his connection, but after Subaru quickly caught on that Julius was hiding something, Subaru wasted no time lecturing him on trust. Julius would then apologize in the most sincere way he could, after which he would reveal Balroy was one of the 9 Divine Generals, the group exclusively considered to be Wallachhia's strongest warriors. How strong were they? Well, if not for Lagunica's covenant with the dragon or the existence of Reinhardt, there was a good chance Lagunica would struggle to compete with the military strength of Wallachia. Subaru found it strange that Julius would choose to compare fighting strength this way, but it made sense considering the two nations weren't really on the best of terms. Now, you'd think Julius killing a foreign general would have started a war, but the circumstances were a lot more complicated than that. You see, this was something he, Reinhardt, and Felix were all involved in. They were currently staying in Wallachia, all because the Wallachian Emperor had wished to meet Reinhardt. Now, normally no country would ever let Reinhardt get close to their borders, but this was, as Julius called, a special dispensation. If not for that, then the treaties in place prevented Reinhardt from ever leaving Lagunica. There was too much risk in allowing him to enter a nation he had no allegiance to. So, it was this visit that just so happened to line up with when Balleroy was attempting a coup, a series of events that unfolded just as Julius was having an audience with him. A duel inevitably emerged from the conflict, one that Julius just barely managed to win somehow. It was during this that Julius got a feel for who this Balleroy was, and what he felt was that the reason for his coup was neither greed nor profit. No, to Julius, he felt there must have been something more. That's why he places Balleroy on such a pedestal, and it's why he looks back on it with such regret. Whatever the case may be, I'm sure these events with Wallachia will become more relevant in the future. Getting back to the task at hand, if this really was an archive of the dead from past to present, then getting anywhere wasn't likely. This gave Subaru time to talk to Meili, a conversation Meili was surprised Subaru didn't have sooner. I mean, she was after all at the mansion for an entire year, so Meili felt Subaru could have asked her these questions whenever. She actually genuinely liked him because of all the presents he gave her, so to her, answering a few questions was nothing. As for why Subaru decided to ask her now, it was because the feeling of death was undeniably all around them. It was a feeling that served to remind him Meili wasn't the little girl who played with dolls that she was in the mansion. Obviously, the entire mansion was on guard after locking her away, but after no attempts to escape and not even any hostility, eventually everyone just let their guards down around her. Petra seemed to be a bit more proactive in creating a relationship, but even she never asked the questions Subaru was asking now. So that then led to Subaru's discussion about her upbringing, the center of which was her blessing. Regardless of whether you looked at it as a curse or a blessing, it was undeniable that Meili's power directly influenced where she ended up today. The story she told was certainly a tragic one, but the way Meili told it made Subaru wonder whether he was actually supposed to feel sad for her or not. To Meili, this was just the way things were, and considering the nature of her blessing, she said it would have been far more strange if she didn't end up using her powers for killing. Obviously that time had passed, but Subaru knew he needed to keep reiterating that just in case. Under no circumstances was Meili ever supposed to kill again. Now, it was right after Meili was finishing her statement of not wanting to read about anyone that the way she trailed off made it seem like there was someone. I'm sure you can guess who that is, but I couldn't tell you whether that's 100% true or not. In any case, eventually the archive would be determined as a fruitless endeavor, since not only did finding information require knowing a dead person, it also required that dead person having memories regarding the information they were looking for. So the odds of that were akin to winning the lottery. Instead, Subaru decided the best thing to do was go up, since there was a good chance more information would be available higher. Julius, however, had a different idea, and that was to throw an army at the problem. With the path to the tower now made clear, if they could somehow rid the desert of all mob beasts, then bringing more people into the tower didn't seem all that impossible. It would certainly make analyzing the archive go a lot faster and even increase the number of books they could read. The thing is, while this was certainly a beneficial plan for the kingdom and its history, it wasn't really beneficial to what the group needed now. That's not to say Julius was in the wrong though, since pretty much all of them were operating with ulterior motives. It's just even enacting Julius's plan was sure to be difficult. It's for this reason Anastasia questioned Shala the way she did, since if you were to think about the tower from the perspective of the person who created it, they wouldn't have gone to such great lengths to protect the archive if they didn't want armies of people storming in to investigate it. If you thought about it that way, then it made sense that this archive's guardian would have special rules in order to protect it, rules which Aridina would then force out of her. Breaking those rules would result in Shala having to kill them, but Shala was certain killing Subaru wasn't even possible. As far as she was concerned, to even try would undoubtedly result in her death. Still, the group couldn't help but be cautious anyway, as whatever command was forcing Shala to act this way, it obviously trumped everything else. It's a shame we didn't get an answer to Subaru's question of what she was, since if not a spirit and not a human, then I'm starting to lean more into the homunculus or robot category. In any case, with the 4 rules of the tower now made clear, both Subaru and Amelia agreed this was even more similar to the trials than they imagined. Not only were they given vague examinations they needed to complete, they also had to follow rules they weren't even made aware of. So the whole style of it matched Echidna's personality to a T. As for how they would know if the rules were broken, well, that was something Shala said would happen automatically. Apparently, if any rules were broken, she would just know. There was nothing Subaru and the others could do to hide it, and there was nothing Shala could do to hide from it. Whatever force was guiding her actions was unyielding. Now, it was while this conversation was happening that Beatrice never stopped analyzing the archive. She had been studying any book she could, not even paying attention to the nickname Shala came up for her. Even Subaru had a tough time bringing her back to reality, as whatever Beatrice was focused on, that seemed to take precedence. It was behavior that was actually a little bit worrisome. With the miasma still affecting how they all interacted with each other, Subaru needed to make sure he was still on top of it. For now, he decided to just shelve it though, so what came next was the discovery of the staircase. A grand stairway starting on the 4th floor and leading to the 2nd. Judging from the way it just went up, there was no doubt this staircase warped the space around it much like how the desert did. If it didn't, then it wouldn't be long before this staircase just led straight outside the tower. In the end, the staircase would be 10 times longer than that which led to the 3rd floor, so at the very least they knew they were higher now. When it came to the start of the test, Once again, Subaru's head would be filled with a voice that sounded exactly like his own. This time he was gonna ask if anyone else heard it, but before he could, that's when a mysterious figure appeared. A person whose aura genuinely froze Subaru to his core. If not for his quivering legs making him unable to move, Subaru would have run out the room just like his instincts were telling him to. In the novel, the figure's eventual tone shift would come after taking a quick scan of the room, since unlike the change in scenery we got in the anime, the moment this man had taken in the white space surrounding him, that was enough for him to realize what it is he was here for. He even seemed to understand this version of himself wasn't the real one. He was a lot more crude and way more vulgar, but aside from that and everything else we saw in the anime, the novel would display the 3 conditions I mentioned last video. Where the previous examination had unlimited time, unlimited attempts, and unlimited challengers, the 3 categories were now all conditionally unlimited. I couldn't tell you what that meant, but whatever those restrictions may be, Shallow was the one to ensure they wouldn't be broken. Episode 72, Julius Juculius, covering chapters 4 and 5 from volume 22 of the light novel. With the man calling himself Stick Swinger wielding what was undoubtedly chopsticks, Subaru would take note of how this was the first person who actually knew how to use them. His time in Pristella revealed chopsticks did in fact exist here, but no one had the form or technique that Raid did. No, the way Raid held his indicated the experience of an expert. It didn't matter how perfect one's technique with chopsticks were though, since stopping a sword with them just wasn't human. If that wasn't evident enough, perhaps stopping Aridana's lightspeed attacks made it so. That's right. Every single one of her attacks moved at the speed of light. None of them really did anything to help Julius, but what did was his efforts to fight in a more unconventional manner. By releasing his mantle, then using the change in friction to create an opening where he could land a kick, that was the exact style of combat Raid was looking for. When Julius then followed up with what I can only assume is traditional swordsmanship, the disappointment Raid felt and the insults he would spew after, for a brief moment triggered some type of emotion from Julius. Subaru couldn't tell whether it was rage, hurt, despair, or something else, but the way Raid trampled over Julius's life's work really went to bother him. So when it came time to land an attack Julius had clearly practiced tens of thousands of times over, even Subaru could tell that there was doubt in it. What happened next was exactly as we saw, all the way up to Amelia's own fight with Raid. If you're wondering why she decided to charge a target that was stationary, Amelia had determined all her other means of attack were useless. If all she did was fire at him from a distance, then the fight would remain a deadlock and no one would get anywhere. The anime does a great job portraying just how relentless Amelia's ice brand arts are, as the way Subaru describes it, she was leaving no openings to intervene. You see, as much as Subaru wanted to jump in and help, with the tempo at which Amelia was attacking, there was no opportunity to help. Unless Amelia started to slow down due to a decrease in stamina, jumping in now would only serve to distract her. That's just how little space Amelia was giving Raid to work with. Now, the first opening came after Amelia stumbled from an ambitious twin sword attack, then the second was with Raid and his inappropriate shenanigans. The outcome was exactly as we saw, along with the additional conditions that everyone else needed to pass. Raid's declaration of that was followed by an intensity unlike any Subaru had felt before, almost like both the battles he just had were child's play. It was as if the air itself was burning now. Beatrice did try to catch Raid on a technicality, but a matter of phrasing wasn't something Raid was gonna let them slide on. In fact, whatever the test was supposed to be beforehand, it was now far different due to Raid's own personal desires. At first, the test was supposed to be beat Raid via whatever means were necessary, but for some reason not yet explained to us, Raid found that boring, forcibly woke himself up and changed the rules to be more entertaining. So, where before it would have been a team challenge to fight Raid to the death, now it was an individual challenge where everyone would likely have to get lucky. It was honestly tough to say which was better. Raid would then make a crude comment about that, leading Subaru to lash out with his whip. Subaru obviously didn't expect to hit him, but he did surprise Raid with his weapon choice. One more crude comment later, and Melee would then ask how Subaru could be so casual with Raid. He did just knock out Julius, grope Amelia, and shock Shala into submission, so why then did he not treat this opponent the same way he did all the others? As far as he knew, this was a man as strong as Reinhard. Still, Subaru seemed intent on continuing the fight regardless, knowing all too well victory was impossible. It was Melee who would convince him retreat was best, but it was actually Raid who would end the test himself. You see, the moment Subaru had asked if they were allowed to leave and come back, Raid, in a seemingly childish fit of rage, simply said he was bored and wanted them out. It was as if he didn't like the idea of them not wanting to fight, so rather than deal with their rejection, he decided to reject them first. This left Subaru a bit confused, since if Raid could just end the test on a whim like that, then who's to say he'll even allow them to challenge him again? Well, there was no guarantee he even would, since at the end of the day, he was the only one who could judge them. So if Raid was pissed and didn't want to do the test, then there was nothing Subaru and the others could do to change that. They could always try and force the challenge, but Raid warned them that when he wasn't open to fighting, that's when he stopped playing. In other words, he would fight to kill. It was in this moment that Subaru knew Raid was serious, since the tone he warned them with was far different from anything they'd yet to see from him. Raid still wore a fiendish smile, but now there was this highly potent murderous intent behind it. It was as if Raid had turned into this evil beast. No one had realized it at the moment, but when Amelia fell to her knees first, that's when everyone conscious realized they weren't breathing anymore. If not for Amelia serving as a reminder, Subaru too would have passed out from suffocation. The thing is, just knowing he had to breathe didn't make it any easier. With the way he struggled to bring air into his lungs, to say Raid's looks could kill would no longer be an expression. So, had Amelia not fallen first, then Subaru knew for sure he would have suffocated too. In the end, Raid would set himself up to take a nap, while the others would carry their wounded and figure out a new plan. So, unlike how the anime made it seem like the group retreated, it was actually more Raid just kicking them out. There wasn't really any other option here. Now, it was as the group discussed what to do next that Subaru's concern for Julius would stem from him noticing there was more to his defeat than just losing. Sure, he survived to get back up and his sword could always be repaired, but what couldn't be fixed was the damage done to Julius's swordsmanship. It's because of that Subaru couldn't be sure of what Julius would do next. Of course, Eridine's actions were concerning too, but for those wondering why she willingly casted so much magic, that's something she'll explain herself later. For now, all we know is exactly what Subaru knows. There was genuine concern for Julius behind her desperation. I would love to talk more about the world's strongest characters too, but aside from their names and silhouettes, the novel doesn't add anything more to them. When it came to the conversation with Shala, for any scenario where Shala was knocked out due to a fault other than her own, she was convinced everyone except for her master would then get slaughtered. I guess that's just how powerful she views herself, and a step above that is Subaru. Or I guess her master. Shala would then reveal the mysterious opponent was Raid, the name of the swordsman spoken of in legends. From mob beasts and master swordsmen to dragons and even a witch, Raid was said to have cut down all of them. He was the first sword saint and one of the 3 heroes who saved the world. Of course, that was all 400 years ago, but considering who it was who built the tower and their tendency to make the exams near impossible, having them challenge the first sword saint seemed exactly like something the sage would do. Fortunately, among their group was someone who knew everything of the sword saints, thus the reason Subaru wanted to go talk to him. As we saw though, Julius would be missing, and this is where the story would switch to his perspective. First, it was actually Raid's, and from it we got a glimpse of the person whose life had always been lived on the battlefield. He had always trotted the line between life and death, so no matter what happened, he was always calm. Whether he was in the mood to play was a different story, but before Julius had even entered the room, Raid knew it was him. From the aura he gave off to the sound of his shoes and his gait, Raid knew exactly who it was who was challenging him again. It's not like he thought it would make much of a difference, but out of courtesy, Raid would warn him this time he wasn't going to be playing. So what came next was exactly as we saw, a one-sided beatdown ending in Julius's defeat. It was in between that the novel gives a whole bunch of self-reflection, Julius's thoughts on everything as they happened. So, the unfamiliar sword wasn't as much of a detriment as you might think, as Julius had trained himself to be comfortable with any sword. So long as he compensated for the heavier tip and thicker blade, Julius felt he could fight the same way he always did. How he controlled the sword was only half the battle though, as footwork was just as important as everything else. In fact, before even mastering the sword, Julius's footwork had come first. This was all due to the teachings of his master, who, despite being unable to increase his own skill, did well to nurture the talents of others. He was the type of person to share time and time again the history of techniques, their development, and their inheritance. Naturally, Julius loved hearing about them, so to him, it was an honor to be able to put them all into practice. A core part of this practice was the incorporation of spirit elements into his swordsmanship, a key aspect serving to handicap Julius in a way the anime didn't show us. You see, with his back against the wall and no time to think, Julius instinctively resorted to the techniques he practiced the most. This would be an offensive blade of wind that extended his range, or a simultaneous casting of fire and water combined with a three-pronged sword strike. With Julius's contract severed and the elements no longer supporting though, every attempt to attack just left him with even more openings. The very thing that once excelled Julius to the title of finest was now rendering him the weakest. Where Julius's spirits would allow him to get the best of anyone, now even the most average of fighters could beat him. He kept making openings thinking his spirits were there to cover him. The only time Raid was somewhat impressed was the moment Julius instinctively recovered by doing something unexpected. Still, nothing changed the fact Julius's swordsmanship was boring, thus the reason Raid felt the need to mock it. Raid wasn't lying when he said the first time he picked up a sword was 3 months ago, so where he could cut light and Julius couldn't cut anything, that was truly disappointing. It was upsetting to know that Julius felt he could win that way. For Julius, this was his everything though, since if unable to prove himself here with his sword, that meant he had nothing. He'd already lost his name, his house, his family, his friends, and even the spirits bound to him, so all Julius had left was the effort he was confronting Raid with now. To him, this was the only proof left that he existed. To Raid, that proof was nothing though, as all it was him copying someone else. Nothing of Julius's swordsmanship was his own. The techniques he admired and looked up to, Julius's very idol was now dragging through the dirt. Julius didn't want to think the way he lived was wrong, but with the way Raid was so relentlessly tearing him apart, now Julius was starting to think he was mistaken. Sure, he may have followed the path of someone else, but never until now did Julius think that that was wrong. Only here did he start wondering if perhaps his way of life, the very core of his beliefs, values, and ideals were misguided. Before, it was those beliefs that gave Julius his strength, but after losing even his sword, Julius could only wonder who it was that was standing here. With no name, no pride, and not even a sword, Julius couldn't even be sure he was Julius anymore. Everything that defined who he was gone. It was Subaru yelling his name that served to remind him he wasn't, but whether he was actually deserving of the name was a different story. That was all Julius could think about before getting enveloped, swallowed by a white light brighter than the white room they were in. Subaru couldn't be sure of what had caused it, but just know this wasn't a creative decision from the anime. It was as if Raid's serious attack truly did cut light itself. Now, what came after was a brief interaction between Subaru and Raid, Subaru calling Raid the usual names while Raid playing it off and calling everything boring. Subaru did ask why Raid acted so generously after saying he was gonna be serious, the answer to which came down to pride. You see, Raid found it far more embarrassing to be forced to retreat by chopsticks than to actually be killed by them. If the positions were reversed, then Raid said he'd much rather die than show his face after getting that type of beatdown. Personally, I think he's being more of a tsundere, but how long that lasts we'll have to see. Either way, for now Raid doesn't seem all too intent on killing them. Moving on to when Subaru was returning back, while everyone was doing all they could to find Julius, Subaru immediately knew exactly where he'd be. He was the only one who understood what it was Julius was going through, so knowing where to find him was easy. Subaru also related to the disappointment Julius felt in meeting this legendary figure, as just like the sage, both weren't what either expected them to be. That said, with the way the person on the gold coin looked older than the Raid currently hosting the exam, that meant the version of him upstairs was simply younger than the person the history book told legends of. That would explain why he didn't recognize Shala, as well as give context for why he mentioned 3 months earlier. Either way, this younger Raid was probably far closer to his prime than the Raid who fought the witch. That didn't give way for much hope, but as an exam, there had to be a way to pass it. In the end, Subaru and Julius would share that touching moment together, both connecting over the similar hardships they went through. Because of the lesson Julius had taught Subaru in the past, Subaru knew better than anyone exactly what it is Julius was feeling. He understood the pain and loneliness that came after such a humiliation, enough to know he couldn't leave Julius to be by himself. The anime then shows Julius's true feelings on Subaru's proud declaration, wrapping up the episode in the best way possible. Episode 73. Coming out of the convenience store, there was a wondrous world, covering chapters 6 and 7 from volume 22 of the light novel. With Julius having to spend some time in the green room again, it's interesting to note his injuries weren't as bad as they looked. It seemed Raid's style was to hold back just enough. Not just anyone was capable of doing that though, especially if all they were wielding were chopsticks. No, the fact Raid could further reinforced why he was a legendary hero. More than ever, Subaru understood how this was the man who worked with the Sage and Holy Dragon to defeat the Witch of Envy. Now, with Julius confined to the green room for a bit, Subaru figured this was a good time to find an answer to the test above them. That much Ram could tell from the expression on his face, but what she also saw was how anxious he was. As far as she could tell, everyone and everything he was currently worried about was right there in the green room. Subaru made sure to tell Ram that wasn't true, since in addition to the obvious candidates of Beatrice and Amelia, Ram was someone he was looking out for too. On the outside, Ram obviously wasn't receptive to Subaru's feelings, but it'd be silly to think those words didn't actually mean a lot to her. In any case, if you were confused about Subaru's reference to measles, that was him just saying Julius's condition was something everyone experienced once. If not as a child, then unfortunately in a far worse state as an adult. Such was how measles were, and the same could be said for Julius's mental state. Now, Subaru's discussion with Shala would circle back to Raid again, Subaru wanting to know if she knew anything that may help them. Whether it be his personality, his habits, his relations, or anything else, at this point, any information was useful information. The thing is, had Shala known anything that could even affect Raid in the slightest, then, according to her, she would have taken advantage of it to get back at him for groping her already. The reason she hasn't been able to do that is because as far as she knew, Raid had no weak points. He did falter with beautiful women and he did scratch his butt while fighting, but neither were traits Subaru could take advantage of. It's not like attractiveness was a guaranteed way of beating him either, since had Amelia struck with the intent to kill, everyone knew Raid never would have left himself open. His reaction obviously changed depending on whether there was an intent to kill him or not. That meant they couldn't let him get serious, enough to prevent his tempers from raising. It wouldn't hurt to keep him entertained too, so that left making sure whatever standards Raid had were met. If they could do that, then brute force wouldn't be necessary. Not that such an option was even feasible to begin with. But anyway, when it came down to it, this second test was honestly just as sadistic as the first. Where the first was testing knowledge from a different world, this next one tested strength against the world's strongest. So, both may at first seem like the answer is straightforward, but with a closer look, it's pretty clear the real goal is something completely different. And the group was currently stuck figuring out what that was. Now, just in case it wasn't evident with Shala's face and tone, the way she spoke about taking their time carried with it the weight of who she was. She may have kept a smile similar to what she usually wore, but now she was speaking from the heart. Her desire to have them stay carried the weight of the guardian who'd protected the tower for centuries. It was in this moment that Subaru realized something crucial, and that was that Shala was never an ally. Sure, she may seem affectionate and she may act friendly, but her words here reminded Subaru her primary role took precedence. That being the case, nothing behind the way she acted truly meant she was an ally to anyone. If there was one thing this sincere smile did show to Subaru though, it was unfortunately the fact Shala couldn't be trusted. The thing is, caution already should have been being taken due to how strong she was, but because of her friendliness and apparent foolishness, both of those together completely diffused their suspicion towards her. So, Here she was telling them they could all stay as long as they wanted, casually reminding them they were stuck whether they liked it or not. Time was most definitely of the essence because with the journey to here a month and the journey back another month, the days they've spent here already could very well turn into yet another month. 3 months were quite a long time to spend on this, especially with the royal selection being the deadline for them. You see, when Subaru first arrived, that was still 3 years out, but with a year and change having passed since then, less than 2 years were left for the Amelia camp to ready themselves. That being the case, to spend 3 months of that here was definitely not ideal. Now, the food the group brought with them in the carriage, but when it came to their water, that was normally created with magic. It was how they got by before the desert, but now that they were in the desert, they could no longer use mana to create water. Reason being that the miasma in the air would cause that water to be tainted. We already know miasma absorbed by their gates causes them to go crazy, but for miasma ingested, that had a completely different effect. Beatrice couldn't be sure of what exactly would happen, but if she had to guess, an internalized miasma buildup would likely cause everyone to develop the same mob beast attracting trait that Subaru had. How then was the group gonna get their water? Well, the spirit in the green room was kind enough to produce purified water for them. So, water was no longer gonna be this issue, but as far as food went, all they had was a month's worth. Don't ask me why they decided to serve so much then, but no one was planning to stay longer than a month anyway. Now, it was while Amelia was making dinner that Subaru, Beatrice, and Shala would then walk around the tower for a bit. Subaru hated the tower's design, mainly because the layout was confusing and there wasn't a map for it. Beatrice agreed, then called the person who designed it twisted, a clear insult to Shala's master that Shala didn't really appreciate. The whole scene wasn't anything particularly important, but these small interactions do build the way everyone perceives each other. So, when Julius joined their dinner, unlike how we saw in the anime, his first words were the acknowledgement of his disrespect towards Amelia. For most, such words would naturally be perceived as chivalrous, but for Ram, she sarcastically called it laudable, suggesting it would have been better to remember his position sooner. She even went so far as to imply her trust with him was broken, a very harsh statement considering what that trust meant to Julius. Even Subaru found it a bit much too, but no one would tell her what she said was unjustified. I mean, sure, Ram was clearly more on edge than usual, but considering what was at stake, it was only natural she wanted to ensure every resource at her disposal was being used to the best of its ability, Julius included. Julius fully understood that, so he had no problem taking responsibility here. All the other girls would then voice their satisfaction with his apology too, even Shala using yet another saying that didn't make sense in this world. Dinner would then proceed exactly as we saw, the only difference being Subaru taking note of Ram's ability to cook. It's not like she couldn't before, it's just that she actively chose not to. It didn't even matter whether Ram was part of her life or not, because Ram's neglect for housework was absolute. It was after dinner that Subaru would have liked to have an all-night meeting figuring out what the best way to approach things were, but considering their opponent and his seeming lack of intent to kill them, it was better to be in peak condition rather than be slightly more organized. If anything, they could just run the test trial and error style, then learn more with every attempt through conversations with Raid. Whatever the plan may be, that was something for the Subaru of tomorrow to figure out. In the meantime, Subaru would get the privilege of spending the night in the green room, Julius conceding believing Rem was the one waiting for him. The truth, however, was the opposite, since it wasn't Rem waiting for the time when they could talk without interruptions. No, the one yearning for it most was Subaru. That was the full extent of his thoughts during his moment here. Fast forward to later on in the night, and the reason Subaru decided to chase the bird instead of waking anyone up is because there was this sinking feeling that something bad was gonna happen. Subaru couldn't be sure of what, but his instincts were telling him not to lose sight of the bird. When it came to finding the secret passage after, its hidden entrance was very similar to the one that the witch cultists had once used. It's for that reason he wasn't entirely surprised, but he was nervous about what awaited him on the other side of it. Well, aside from the strangeness of it being Eridina, what was even more weird were the birds accompanying her. First off, none of the birds were the same, so where the anime made it seem like they were all doves, in actuality, they were a flock made up of completely different species and colors. There was no unifying principle that made it seem like these birds even belonged here. Next was the way these birds acted, since you'd think they'd make noise or at least rustle their wings a bit, but not a single bird moved or even chirped. They were these stationary objects whose sole purpose seemed to be observation. All they appeared to do was stare at them. Such peculiarity led Subaru to be on the defensive, since if any of his past deaths had taught him anything, it would be that being careless in situations like these was life-threatening. It's because of this that Aridina would make it clear she wasn't a threat, only bearing malice towards the two examiners. That's when Subaru would fill her in on who Raid was, followed by his intent to speak openly to her. Instantly, Aridina would flip like a switch, switching her personality in a way that made her seem like a completely different person. She would then ask if Subaru was gonna join her by the balcony, but considering the name of who it was he was talking to now, Subaru decided it was best to refrain from that. This hesitation was the one thing Aridina found the most annoying, since even if Echidna was her creator, to constantly be compared to a person she didn't even know felt awful. It was something Subaru agreed he'd try to work on, but at the end of the day, that was just how deep of a scar Echidna had left on him. It also didn't help that Aridina's behavior and mannerisms were all exactly like how Echidna's were. Subaru would then ask how Aridina could just casually touch these birds, suggesting they might just swarm her and peck her to death. Aridina could only chalk up such a fate to his imagination, but Subaru doubled down by saying he had a bad run-in with some bunnies once. It was ever since that he'd always been a bit nervous when surrounded by animals, a fair response considering what it was that had happened to him. Next came Aridina's probing into Subaru's past, a topic Subaru had never had to navigate before. With Anastasia having retraced his steps perfectly, Subaru wasn't sure what to say happened before that. It was strange to see his origins and his identity as an unknown person were what was holding him back now. Before, Anastasia just assumed Subaru was this unknown rookie knight blessed with the accomplishment of multiple great feats, but after the battle in Pristella and now this journey to the tower, her and Aridina's impressions of him were starting to change. In truth, she wanted nothing more than for Subaru to just be open with her, but no matter how trustworthy or sincere Aridina made herself out to be, Subaru's past with Echidna made it so he could never trust her. The more Aridina's behavior matched that of the Witch of Greed, the harder it became for Subaru to believe anything she said. To him, there was what could only be described as the residual stench of the witch. Trust was a two-way street though, and with Subaru being unwilling to give his, Aridina justifiably couldn't give hers in exchange. Thus the reason both were on the fence about each other. In the end, they would just chalk their meeting up to coincidence, then proceed to discuss both where they were and the new company they had. The balcony they figured was meant for Shala to snipe people, while the birds Aridina believed were part of a puzzle. They were definitely alive since their bodies felt warm, but with the way they didn't react to anything, that made Aridina feel like they were operating with a purpose. Ideally, she would have liked to take one apart and see what was inside, but for her to kill one, that would require magic. So instead she would just ask Subaru to strangle one, a request he was surprisingly open to. Hunting had actually become an extensive part of Subaru's training, so killing birds and rabbits were no longer difficult for him. Killing for food was far different from killing for an experiment though, so if he was to kill the bird, it'd be so that they can eat it after. At least that way they could manage their food situation better. Now, Julius's arrival was preceded by a very important event because if you didn't notice, this was a bird that came from behind Aridina and Subaru. That meant it was another bird from inside the tower, one we can only assume was leading Julius here. If true, it changes the context of this meeting from coincidence to something more. Almost like someone wanted all three of them to meet here. That being the case, for three separate birds to lead three separate people all to the same meeting spot, I don't think that was a coincidence at all. Then, as if the birds' jobs were done, all would fly off at the sound of Julius asking his question. This was a difficult question to answer since the secrets shared by Subaru and Aridina involved everything from artificial spirits and the Witch of Greed all the way to gluttony's authority and other things. It wasn't a conversation one could just walk into the way Julius just did. Now, not noticing his master wasn't even his master naturally went to hurt Julius, but from Subaru's perspective, Julius was set to fail from the beginning. His life was already crumbling right in front of him, so how could someone with so much going on expect to be the proper first knight he was supposed to be? Like, if being a knight meant not being allowed to hurt, then to Subaru, being a knight was a curse on Julius. When it came to Aridina saying who she was next, though her resolve to die was certainly there, in truth, she didn't want to die. Her dying wasn't even guaranteed to bring Anastasia back, but whether Julius actually believed her was a different story. I mean, this could after all just be an evil spirit saying whatever was necessary to stay in Anna's body. A large part of her desire to stay alive, though, stemmed from the incomplete relationship her and Anastasia shared together. It was one a proper spirit mage could never understand. So, she didn't expect Julius or Subaru to get what it was she was saying, but she did hope that they would at least respect it. Julius's own acknowledgement of it stemmed from a desperate attachment to one of the few things he had left, the fealty he pledged to the person he valued most. With all else lost and that fealty now denied, though, Julius couldn't even properly feign calmness anymore. In fact, it was astonishing he didn't show any emotion beyond that. The way he still managed to keep composed despite everything, well, that was just a testament to the way he lived his life. He fully understood arguing would get them nowhere. So, instead, he would use Aridina as motivation, allowing her to speak in her true voice as a reminder of who it was he was missing. Aridina couldn't help but be saddened by those words, but if they were what motivated Julius, then she couldn't say anything. In the end, Julius's actions could be reduced to one single sentence. To Subaru, it was the sentiment of even if he was forgotten, he would never forget. That was the feeling Subaru was certain kept Julius going forward. Now, Julius's own final words acted like a thorn to Subaru, enhancing his guilt instead of relieving it. Subaru had hoped Julius would express his grievances, but rather than vent his anger like how he thought he would have, instead, Julius just made Subaru feel worse. That's why he would walk around the tower looking all dejected, an emotion Ram would pick up instantly. Aside from that, the reason she had attempted to go up to Raid was to try her hand at a sneak attack. At first, she thought she might be able to assassinate him while he was sleeping, but after getting halfway up, she realized it was impossible. Halfway up the stairs was enough for her to sense that Raid's threat level made Garf's look like nothing. It was before leaving that Ram would make a surprisingly crude comment, after which is when we get the twist. First, it's important to know what it is Subaru was trying to do prior. His mind was enveloped with the thought of how to handle Raid, the key to which revolved around making him satisfied without letting him get serious. It was a concept that was most definitely vague, but at the very least, it was a surefire way to ascend the tower without anyone dying. It was then that Subaru believed all they had to do was firm up that plan, a thought which led to a eureka moment. We don't know what it is he thought or what those thoughts relate to, but what he did say was, if this works well. 4 words likely pertaining to a gamble of sorts. Subaru couldn't say whether his idea was sure to work or not, but if it did, he said it had the potential to move things forward greatly. So it was that exciting thought which led him to run off deeper into the tower, the only things remaining of him his footsteps. Now, it'll probably be a while before we find out what it is Subaru was trying to do, so if I was to make a personal guess as someone who only reads the novel up to where we are in the anime, I think Subaru went to talk with Raid. That talk then led to Subaru succeeding, and whatever awaited him at the floor above was what rendered Subaru in the state we see now. At least I think these were the stairs leading up to Raid, but whether I'm right or wrong, don't tell me anything. It's just what I think is most plausible. In any case, in the novel, what happened next was Subaru's awakening, the beginning of Subaru's new adventure. The anime depicts it pretty much line for line, but what ultimately gave away the fact he was isekai'd was Patrash. Now, I really wish I could tell you more, but that's exactly where Volume 22 ends. There is, however, an interlude about the Witch of Wrath, but that could still be included next episode. It is worth noting the official ReZero YouTube channel uploaded a brand new music video for Redo, the very first opening from Season 1. More importantly than that, though, is the way the music video shows the events of the anime in reverse. We go backwards from Season 4 to Season 1, almost as if to imply we're starting all over again. The very last scene being Subaru coming out of the convenience store. So, with the name of the episode being what it is, I imagine Subaru's memories are wiped all the way back to that. How long that lasts I couldn't tell you, but the implications of such a fate flip the story right on its head. Everything the group was working towards now just comes to a standstill. Episode 74, Who Are You? Covering chapters 1 and 2 from volume 23 of the light novel. The Subaru we know might seem like a pretty amazing person, but the Subaru of old was about as average as one could be. If there was one thing that differentiated him from the rest, it was the fact he tended not to show up for class. In fact, where most people typically dealt with life by making a series of difficult choices, Subaru's specialty was running away from those choices. He was a bit better than most at running away from the things he didn't like. So, when it came time to choose between going to college or finding a job, Subaru instead just stopped going to school completely. And before he knew it, he'd become the exact type of delinquent most parents wept over. This was the Subaru that was here now, officially a high school dropout. More importantly than that though was the two girls trying to figure out whether or not something was wrong with him. Beatrice was stunned and her hand trembled as she hung onto his sleeve, but as much as it hurt to see her that way, Subaru couldn't do anything to reassure her. He was too caught up in his own confusion to spare a thought for her problems. It was when he took in the current state of his body that Subaru would notice all these scars on him. They weren't something Subaru really minded himself, but he did feel guilty when he thought about what his parents might think. It was another issue to throw on the pile of complicated feelings he felt between him and his parents. Subaru's subsequent introductions would proceed pretty much the same, then at breakfast Subaru would meet even more attractive people. That was the one thing he felt they all had in common, making him feel bad as the only person bringing the average down. When it came to meeting Shala next, she would make an interesting comment about how this wasn't the first time Subaru forgot her. If those words were to be taken literally, then perhaps Subaru, or in this context the sage, loses his memories more times than we might think. Either way, according to Shala, this wasn't the first. When Ram tried to separate Subaru after, her back and forth with Amelia would give Subaru clues as to what his role was. Ram had mentioned Subaru being a servant to Roswell, so that led Subaru to think he was some sort of errand boy. Immediately, Amelia would try to correct that, but before she could finish, Subaru would joke about being lovers. She was, after all, exactly his type, but as far as he was concerned, she was way out of his league. That's why Subaru felt he could joke about it, him feeling nothing when she stated that they didn't share a romantic relationship. Subaru would then tell everyone that it was fine, calling Amelia and Beatrice in ways the original Subaru never would. That much we saw for Amelia, but what they didn't show after was Beatrice's reaction when he called her Betty. It was a far cry from the Bayako that she was used to hearing. Seeing her expression definitely hurt Subaru because for him, he didn't like letting people down like that. So when Ram confronted him the most aggressively out of anyone, all Subaru could do was apologize for not being able to live up to her expectations. It was clear she was desperately trying to cling on to something that he had forgotten. In the end, all Subaru could do was apologize for forgetting, for not being able to answer her, and so much more. As they were now, both were helpless to the circumstances they now found themselves in. Now, it was on the way back that Subaru would overhear a conversation between all the others, specifically Amelia telling them why Subaru would never joke about something like this. Because he knew just how painful it was to be forgotten, Amelia knew he would never joke about forgetting someone. They were words that carried with them absolute trust in Subaru, but to the Subaru of now, he didn't think that at all. Perhaps they were meant for the other Subaru, but as he was now, he felt no one should have faith in him. It was once Subaru had returned to the room that, as we saw, Julius would reintroduce himself. Ram did say in their conversation Subaru's treatment of him was cruel, but for what reason Subaru didn't know. And while Julius did consider themselves friends, the truth of the matter was that he wasn't sure if the real Subaru felt the same. If the Subaru of now was to make an opinion off an initial impression, he did say Julius looked like the type of person he'd snap at the first time meeting him. In any case, with Anastasia's confession coming right after, Ram's blunt assessment of the situation left Subaru with zero confidence at all. He understood they were here to ascend the tower and find a way to wake up Rem, but with the group unable to progress and Subaru being one of the reasons why they couldn't progress, as much as he felt bad about it, Subaru was ready to call this mission impossible. It was right as he was about to say it that's when Amelia would be the shining ray of hope for everyone. That was enough for Subaru to look forward with reckless determination, a feeling Subaru was probably mistaking for decisiveness. You see, because Subaru had forgotten just how great the barrier in front of them was, Julius felt the need to remind him the dangers of overconfidence. That one remark was all Subaru needed to get a grasp on how his relationship with Julius used to be, fully believing they weren't quite friends or enemies. Because of the clear emotional distance between them, Subaru felt whatever relationship they'd had was built gradually. A surprisingly on-the-mark read considering he'd only talked with Julius for a minute. It was after that Aridina would share more information about her relationship with Anastasia, unsure what to actually call herself. At first, she called herself a friend, but when Amelia questioned how deep the relationship actually was, she helped Aridina see they were actually family. The existence of a contract wasn't what solidified their bond, but rather how much the two of them cared for each other. Aridina would then explain why she decided to reveal all this now, also mentioning that Subaru was aware of her secret first. Ram was of course pissed because to hear Subaru had kept yet another secret from her, well, perhaps he tucked his memories away with all his other secrets. Millie would then add fuel to the fire herself, after which Subaru would make quite the funny remark. Then came the talks about how Subaru ended up like this, a conversation that eventually made its way to Shala. With Shala continuously calling Subaru master, finally Subaru would ask why that was. Normally he wouldn't mind having such a woman chase after him, but something was off regarding her affection. Unlike how Amelia's or Beatrice's felt earnest, to Subaru, Shala's was fundamentally different. In the end, Julius would state what I'm sure everyone was thinking, and that was the clear detriment of not having Subaru to support them anymore. He didn't mean to say it as if they all relied on him, but the truth was, Subaru supported all of them tremendously. So now that he was gone, all of them were feeling it. Now, in the anime, the group would exclude Subaru from going to the archive, but in the novel, they would actually take him. It's here everyone would learn Subaru could no longer read or write anymore, so in the words of Ram, he was useless baggage here in the archive too. Still, they would continue looking for answers anyway, and when Subaru suggested putting all the useless books away into a pile on the floor, Aridina would say how that would likely break one of the tower's rules. You'd think where the episode ended, Subaru would have no prior knowledge of those rules, but it was here in this moment that everyone would explain it to him. They would tell him he could neither disrespect the archive nor try to leave, and if he did, Shala would transform into a merciless killing machine. The thing is, considering how ridiculous all that sounded, Subaru just assumed it was a joke. He just couldn't see Shala transforming into a murderous Terminator, despite her literally referencing one of its lines. Plus, with Subaru not being aware of her inhuman strength, he wondered how dangerous someone like her could be anyway. In any case, with Subaru not being able to do literally anything, all he could do was sit there and wait. This was exactly what everyone wanted him to do, even making him promise he'd stay with them. So, unlike how in the anime everyone was fine with leaving Subaru on his own, pretty much all of them felt he needed to be watched. Based on the results of his actions, they couldn't trust him to just sit around and wait anymore. It was in the meantime that Subaru would get more acquainted with Meili, one of two people not helping with the investigation. She was, after all, brought for one job only, so anything else she couldn't be bothered with. The other person not helping was Shala because, according to her, she couldn't read or write either. Just talking to her would lead her to make her usual advances on Subaru, actions he found rather unrefined for a woman. This was apparently something Shala's master would always tell her, yet another thing that never changed about him. Now, I couldn't tell you what Shala's implications were behind the choice of her words here, but I think she and Subaru were talking about two different things here. Either way, with the nature of their past relationship laid out right in the open, Subaru would be embarrassed by what he thought she really meant. He would then hide his face deep within his knees, waiting for the investigation to turn up nothing. It was after that's when Subaru would be testing his newfound abilities, only finding he had more endurance. His strength was a bit more noticeable too, but not in any way that one would call a divine blessing of sorts. He would also test a series of iconic transformation poses, but as far as powers went, he had none. So, as much as Subaru wanted to be the guy that everyone could rely on, it seemed all he had was bonds he couldn't remember. This, however, was where he wanted to be, and with the place they were in being all he had, Subaru wanted nothing more than to find the strength that would allow him to remain. He didn't want to be the same Subaru that was always receiving and always consuming. Still, the more evident it became that Amelia and the others were worrying about him, the more he hated himself for taking up a place he hadn't earned. That's why while everyone was discussing how to approach the Subaru situation, Subaru would be out in the hallway figuring out if he had powers. He would also ponder all the possibilities of how he ended up like this, considering the trials he accomplished and the trials he was yet to accomplish. He was well aware a test of strength awaited them up on the second floor, but as much as his kendo skills made him better than an amateur, he wasn't so foolish as to think he had actual combat ability. It was once Subaru was done with his experiments that, in an attempt to get back to base, he would end up at the staircase. Thoughts of his old self filled his mind as he pondered the architectural oddity that was this staircase, leading him not to notice he was falling until it was too late. That said, as far as deaths for Subaru go, this would be quite the tame one. The only pain he felt was the burning sensation when starting to choke on his own vomit, but aside from that, Subaru would be unconscious before he even hit the floor. With that, I guess we can restart the counter now, so with death number 1 bringing with it the confusion of not knowing he had even died, Subaru would really lean into the idea that his superpower was precognition. To him, it was a really hit-or-miss hard-to-use ability, but if properly harnessed, it could definitely be powerful. That said, knowing what was gonna happen didn't make it any less painful when it did. So, when Beatrice had to set aside her emotions and speak courageously with heartbroken eyes, the way she trembled hurt far more than it did last time. Even when she resolved herself to put up with him anyway, to Subaru, these relationships were nothing but sandcastles. The foundations were certainly there, but that's pretty much all there was. And to the Subaru of now, he was certain that wouldn't be good enough for the Subaru of old. Subaru would then manage to gloss over the fact he somehow remembered their names, proceeding with his day as closely to the first as possible. He wanted to test how accurate his prophetic dreams were. If he did have this power of prophecy though, then what Subaru found strange was the fact that no one had commented on it. I mean, considering how powerful such a thing could be, Subaru found it hard to believe that all these people would keep it from him. That being the case, the natural explanation then was that they just didn't know. That in turn meant old Subaru never told them, making new Subaru wonder why they didn't. That then planted a small seed of distrust, all stemming from the question of what was Subaru thinking. That the anime made very clear, but what the anime didn't show after was the way he acted differently. In fact, with reliving everything being like watching a movie for the second time, Subaru couldn't replicate the same emotions he did the first time around. So, when everyone was reeling over the unreasonable situation they found themselves in, Aridina would comment on Subaru's rather calm demeanor. He was clearly the least disoriented out of all of them. Really, he was dealing with all sorts of emotions, just not the ones everyone was concerned with right now. There was sympathy for their efforts, guilt towards his abandonment, distaste towards the Subaru he was supposed to be, then all sorts of negative emotions constantly mixing together and growing. So, despite his best efforts to replicate the previous loop as best as he could, Subaru's change in behavior also changed the mood. Compared to last time, things were off. Still, he would manage to lead them to the archive anyway, Subaru feeling overwhelming guilt for effectively deceiving everyone. In fact, the only person he felt relief when talking to now was surprisingly Shala. Because she treated him the same regardless of whether he remembered her or not, Subaru found a bit of comfort in that. Once Subaru was back to where he was in the previous loop, a lot of time would be spent trying to figure out the specifics of his superpower. The more questions he asked though, the more he felt he would end up in butterfly dream territory. A terrifying state where thoughts went in circles and questions remained unanswered. The premise was to question the fuzzy line between dreams and reality, so in Subaru's case, he wondered if he ever really woke up from his dream, or was the reality he experienced now just another dream? To him, the only way to find that answer was to go past where his dream had ended, after which he would commit to telling the others about it. He was so desperate to change the situation that now he was willing to do something old Subaru never did. That's when Subaru would overhear their words of doubt, a conversation they may not have even had Subaru not acted so strangely before. That's right, Subaru's behavior would be a key reason cited for their suspicion of him. It's not like they didn't trust the Subaru of old, but this blank slate Subaru was far different, much to the point that Ram would straight up say he couldn't be trusted. Trust was clearly the pain point half the party was dealing with, so when Meili suggested they just ask him if they could trust him, that's when Subaru would run away. He had every intent to speak up and break the ominous vibe he was feeling, but the tension was far too much for him to handle. So, just like in his past life, Subaru was once again running away from life's tough choices. Whether due to the miasma or just the overwhelming pressure of everything, it's important to note the miasma definitely is still affecting him. The only reason it's not mentioned in the novel is because the concept of it isn't something Subaru is aware of. So, considering the miasma is still this ever-present toxin, its effects on people's behaviors should definitely not be forgotten. In any case, with the group showing they didn't trust Subaru at all, Subaru's feelings were hurt in a way that he currently couldn't manage. He didn't expect them to trust him right away, but he was at least hoping they'd have a little faith in him. What he'd heard back there though was zero faith whatsoever. It's for that reason Subaru now saw himself nothing but a fool, since what he thought was at least a sandcastle of trust was in actuality just him greedily trying to claim what the old Subaru had earned. That's why he felt they wouldn't believe a word he said. If anything, the whole situation was hopeless from the start. He couldn't prove he had his powers, and he couldn't be the Subaru they wanted him to be, so with nowhere to go and no place to fit in, Subaru knew he had nothing. What happened next was what could only be described as a recurring hell. Pain that refused to let Subaru go. The anime does a fantastic job animating it, really highlighting what the novel grotesquely describes as Subaru becoming nothing but a lump of flesh. He had already lost his memories, but now he was losing his form. In the end, all that was left was a sack of blood, a repeatedly malformed thing that couldn't even be called Subaru anymore. His existence was quite literally shattered now. It was this pain that would overwrite Subaru's very being, enveloping every emotion until the world itself was pain. Everything else just seemed worthless, so when that pain was finally released and Subaru awoke, his only thoughts were to escape the pain that was surely coming back for him. Eventually, the thought of pain transformed into the thought of death, so now Subaru felt that that's what he was running from. It was as if he could hear death's footsteps approaching him, so out of desperation to get away, he would run without thinking. To Subaru, death had come for him already, so why was it that it was coming for him again? It was a suffocating sensation that made him feel like he was drowning. It was when he ended up at Raid's that at first Raid was willing to let him go. He just told him to come back with the girls, but when Subaru ignored him, well, we already know what happened. It was after that Subaru would take the time to try and make sense of everything, finally coming to see where it was he went wrong. You see, Subaru had made the mistake of trying to run away from everything. He couldn't handle the events of what had happened in the first loop, so when he came back a second time, he created a convenient excuse that made sense of it for him. He'd even gone so far as to think of the whole situation as someone else's problem. That he now knew was a grave mistake, and by not facing the problem head-on like how he should've, he was now facing a world of suffering beyond his wildest dreams. All he could feel was futility, loss, despair, and negativity, each of which made him yearn for the life he'd lived only hours ago. The voice Subaru then heard after was the very thing he was trying to run away from. It was death finally caught up, ready to take him again. Not only that, this time Subaru could see the very face of death, and the visage mocking his entire existence was none other than his own. So, with death being him and him mocking who he was, Subaru refused to be killed by himself. If he was gonna die, then so be it, but Subaru was hellbent on making sure it wasn't him that caused it. So, for the first time, Death's smirk would finally change, shifting into an almost annoyed look. It seemed upset that Subaru wasn't gonna do what it wanted, and that in turn filled Subaru with life again. The more Subaru carried on, the angrier Death got, up until Satella came in and shared what could only be described as an unimaginably powerful emotion with him. Subaru had a tough time putting to words what emotion that felt like, but if he combined every time any person in the world had ever said "I love you," to him that would equate to her "I love you." That was just how much passion Subaru had felt from her. That passion then turned into pain, as the way she caressed his heart made it seem like she was doing so out of jealousy. It was a sensation strong enough to make Subaru piss himself. A sorry state Death was once again mocking him for. Now Subaru could only think he'd been duped, punished for thinking he was strong enough to beat Death. In the end, Subaru could only see everything as a punishment for being weak and punishment for being foolish. All he could do was cry as he wished for Death to just take him already. It's one thing not to trust other people, but the misanthropy is terminal once you stop being able to trust even yourself. These were Subaru's thoughts as he contemplated what to do next, his world crumbling under the intense pressure of a mystery murder plot, forgotten memories, and the constant loops ending in death. His last loop was one of the most intense yet, but even with the anime portraying it as well as it did, there were a lot of interesting details left out that you're gonna want to know about. Like, here you might think Subaru got stopped at the 4th gate just like how he did before, but in actuality this was the 5th. We also gotta talk about Subaru's transformation into the Aura monster, so if you want to see how that all went down in the novel, here's everything that didn't make it into this episode. Episode 75, Empty Shell, covering chapters 3 and 4 from volume 23 of the light novel. Here we are, Subaru all broken and battered, the group filled with all sorts of emotions after finding out Subaru was this hollow version of who he used to be. Whether it was grief, disbelief, disgust, or something else, Subaru couldn't receive them, as to him, these people were nothing but strangers. All their concern and all their familiarity, that was directed towards the real Subaru, not whoever he was now. That was what Subaru felt was the worst, since not remembering anything about these people he could deal with, but to be on the receiving end of what could only be described as uncomfortable love, that was the one thing Subaru couldn't handle. He felt it unfair that the problems of Subaru were now his. That would be the feeling which would spur Subaru to run away, a decision Patrash would try and prevent him from making. Though he couldn't understand why, Patrash was trying her best to get Subaru to stop. To Subaru, this was her just being annoying though. There was a clear loneliness in her eyes he wanted no part of. It was after that he would gather some food and water for himself, contemplating which of the 7 suspects was the one that killed him. Since he didn't know if any were even his comrades before he lost his memory, Subaru felt it was possible that all were assassins trying to kill him. All he needed to do was convince himself Beatrice and Amelia's eyes were a lie, then that was a story he could force himself to believe. In the meantime, Subaru would fill himself with thoughts justifying his actions, doing whatever he could to make this choice of his easier to swallow. Ultimately, what it all came down to was the simple fact he didn't want to die. So his plan was to leave and get to whatever human settlement he could find. He was fully aware crossing a desert was dangerous, but at the same time, doing something to try and live was better than hanging around somewhere he was guaranteed to die. So, one last feeling of guilt had pressured him to remain, but his lingering attachment to his old world pressured him more. As he was now, Subaru was confident he didn't want to be here. He needed to return home because his father and mother were waiting for him. Well, Subaru wouldn't get very far, as after a second step, he would be ambushed by a sandworm. Unlike how in the anime Subaru was tossed around by it though, in the novel Subaru would have far more of a face-off. For a second, you could actually call his actions fairly strategic, as Subaru would immediately come up with a plan and implement it. In order to live, Subaru knew he needed to get back inside, so that simply meant dodging the worm and making a run for it. Dodge he did, and with a movement that channeled the memories of his experience from the year he didn't remember, Subaru would avoid the sandworm easily. I couldn't tell you how much he actually saw of his past, but the novel does make it seem like those memories are still in there. Now all Subaru needed to do was run, but with 60 feet separating him and the entrance, the sandworm's tail would catch him like how we saw in the anime. The rest would be the same too, up until Subaru dropped into what he at first thought was hell. This was after all a world of fantasy, so it wouldn't be strange if a literal hell plane existed. Eventually, the overwhelming darkness would fill Subaru's mind with fear, leading him to run as that was the only thing he could do. You see, where in the anime Subaru had a lantern, in the novel, he had nothing. He was forced to traverse the underground with no vision whatsoever. It was after several hours he had finally made his way to the gates, his will nearly broken multiple times before that. I mean, he was after all walking in absolute darkness, so after slipping down sandhills, running into walls, and getting sand dumped on him by tremors, Subaru was almost starting to believe that this was hell. The only reason he decided to keep running regardless is because he was too frightened by the thought of what would happen if he stopped. He was so desperate to get away up until he came across this stench, a putrid smell that acted as a thread for Subaru to grasp onto. With this thread leading him to one gate after another, Subaru would find the more gates he opened, the stronger the smell got. It was that smell which would guide him where to go, since still Subaru couldn't see anything. The breeze he felt and the stench he followed were the only guiding factors Subaru could use to navigate here. Finally, Subaru would make it to a gate that wouldn't open, but unlike how last time he got stuck on the fourth, this right here was the fifth. It's an interesting detail I'm surprised they decided not to share in the anime. I couldn't tell you what exactly changed which allowed Subaru to progress one gate further, but what I can't tell you is his traversal deeper just meant the miasma was going to affect him more. So, as a fierce rage overwhelmed him in this unfair situation, Subaru was ready to bludgeon the god who put him here. Some inexplicable feeling made him know these gates were made just for him, so that just made him more mad when it wouldn't open for him. He was frustrated and confused over the fact what lay beyond the gate was the truth of his role in this world. His inner thoughts would question the blockade over and over again, finally culminating with this. It's the first time we've ever seen a word censored like this, so perhaps this version of Subaru is remembering something related to his true purpose. Whatever the truth may be, it's immediately after that Subaru would be teleported. As much as how it happened didn't make sense, Subaru's reality was demanding he accept it. It was as if it was getting payback for him trying to run away. That's when Subaru would see the situation as hopeless, finally accepting that if he didn't want to die, he simply needed to kill his killer first. That was, after all, the reason he was running away, so if he could just find and kill them before they kill him, everything, at least to him, would then be solved. He did have the advantage of knowing someone was coming for him too, so if he could just leverage that information, Subaru felt he could do it. So, with an ominous curse constantly being repeated, Subaru's thirst for vengeance would turn him into some kind of aura monster. He truly felt his body get stronger every time he said it. This was a Subaru completely filled with toxic miasma, ready to kill all in the name of protecting himself. That in turn led to the decision of killing the first person he saw, a choice he fortunately wouldn't have to follow through with. Unfortunately for him though, what he experienced instead was his first exposure to death. You see, never in his life had Subaru ever seen a dead body before, not even at a funeral. So, with Shala's gored body being the first corpse he'd ever seen, the shock was so staggering the impact burned itself right into Subaru's soul. It had made him puke all over the dead body right in front of him. Still, Subaru was a man with a mission, so with absolute solitude being what he was striving for, Subaru would contemplate how he was going to kill the other 6 suspects. He had even thought about how he was going to get rid of Raid after them. So, as Subaru honed the power his repeated curse granted him, Subaru was even more prepared to kill than before. When 4 more bodies were found instead though, finally he started wondering what worth did all this resolve have. Now, an interesting thing to note about Meili's corpse is that her death was the cleanest out of anyone's. Julius had clearly attempted to shield her, but even after that, she was only slashed once. It was a stark contrast when compared to the brutal states everyone else was left in. What's even more interesting is that where everyone's faces were putting on one type of pained expression or the other, Meili's face was almost tranquil. Their bodies were also covered with white cloths too, so whoever was here before Subaru put in the effort to mourn them. That, however, just added to the confusion, so now Subaru would try to investigate a bit. With the blood having dried, Subaru guessed their deaths could have occurred at least a dozen hours ago. He wasn't sure how long he'd spent underneath the tower, but clearly it was longer than he thought. Subaru would then move on to the green room, hoping to find Amelia and Beatrice's corpses next. If he did, then his mind could finally be put at ease as the killer would no longer be around him. There he would only find Patrash though, bringing us to one of the most tough-to-watch scenes in a while. For Subaru, he had initially found wounding a living creature exhilarating, but after seeing no reaction, that thrill turned into frustration. Now Subaru could only yell and scream as every confusing emotion he felt came bubbling up to the surface. It was after that's when Subaru would be attacked, the novel making it seem like it was Satella doing so. Because the fog resembled the veil of shade Subaru had seen earlier, he could only assume this was the same person attacking him now. And with the way the fog seemed so hell-bent on getting to him, Subaru instinctively knew getting consumed by it would lead to a fate far more terrifying than death. If the torture his heart felt was anything to go off of, to Subaru this fog was probably on a whole nother level. For a moment, Subaru actually considered throwing away his life instead, but with the certainty of return by death not being 100%, Subaru couldn't commit himself to do it. Plus, he didn't really want to die to begin with. He didn't think he'd done anything wrong, so why was it then that he had to die? Well, these were the thoughts Subaru wept over as Patrash ran for their lives, this dragon the only one answering his plea to be saved. So, where before Patrash's eyes only showed him a deep loneliness, now they shone with powerful resolve. It was clear all she wanted to do was save Subaru. And with the fog damaging anything it touched, Patrash had even gone the extra mile to ensure Subaru didn't get touched by any of it. She would actively sacrifice her own body in order to make sure the shadow didn't reach Subaru. That's why Subaru had come out relatively unscathed, now at the balcony he previously met Aridina at. If there was one thing that didn't seem like it belonged, it would be the single white bird that just landed on the railing in front of him. Then came the realization he was gonna die, followed by the feeling someone was behind him. The novel doesn't say who, but their line of "try to catch me next time" does make it seem like they're aware of return by death. With that bringing an end to loop number 3, loop number 4 would begin with Subaru showing gratitude to the one being who hadn't hurt him. There was a bit more back and forth with Beatrice expressing her jealousy, but with that not being entirely important, what was the plan Subaru devised to try a route that he hadn't tried yet. This time he would test the others, observing how they interacted with him if they assumed he was still the same. It would definitely be tough considering how he didn't know the intricacies of everyone's relationship with him, but so long as he was just himself, Subaru believed he could get by. Amelia's closeness with him was a recurring point of confusion since in addition to knowing Subaru better than most, Amelia also said nothing about the fact Subaru almost strangled her. In the novel, Subaru didn't stop as he fully had his hands on her neck before Beatrice finally said something. Still, Amelia didn't even blink as to her, such an action meant nothing. So, because of this, Subaru could only assume Amelia was privileged, sheltered, or both, or perhaps she was just really good at hiding her ulterior motives. Either way, her lack of boundaries was extremely peculiar to Subaru. Next, Subaru would have his one-on-one with Julius, all because he assumed whatever happened between them last night was the root cause of how his memories were lost. Subaru just assumed Julius was in the archive when it happened, so this was him trying to find out more. He would make fake statements aligning his story with Julius's, not knowing he was hurting Julius far more than he could even imagine. For Julius, who was still coming to terms with everything, this was Subaru attempting to resolve his own problems before even considering Julius's. It's the reason he would call Subaru selfish. The rest of the conversation would go as we saw, basically confirming for Subaru Julius had nothing to do with his memories. The grief in his eyes were genuine enough to show Julius was dealing with his own problems. At the very least, now Subaru knew of some secret with Aridina, some shady dealings new Subaru could only be suspicious of old Subaru for. Again, that one question just kept coming up. The question of what was Subaru Natsuki thinking? So, with Subaru no closer to finding out how he lost his memories, he would be contemplating his next move when Meili showed up. She would have a request, one pertaining to their discussion from back in the library. If you remember from episode 4, there were two things that the two had talked about here. The first was Subaru offering to look for her parents' books should she want to see them, and the second was how those books appeared when someone died. Meili could honestly be referring to either, so either she wants Subaru to help in looking for her parents' books, or she's offering to kill someone in order to see how those books originate. Unfortunately, we don't get to know though, as in these few frames here, Meili would be killed. Welcome to the case of Subaru Natsuki's murder, an intriguing story declared so by Subaru himself. If Subaru was and wasn't the one who killed the victim, then could the Subaru we see be the one held accountable for it? Well, that's an answer Subaru didn't want to find out, leading to the increasingly frustrating series of events we saw in the anime. The thing is, where normally a lot of these situations could be fixed by return by death, I'm not so sure what happened this episode can. This is because within Subaru there now exists 3 personalities, 2 supposedly his own, then the very essence of Meili making for the 3rd. So even if Subaru was to die and reset, I don't know if return by death is enough to clear those personalities out. What I do know though is that it's very interesting to see the way all these personalities interact with each other, especially Meili, who in the novel has quite a few more secrets revealed about her. So if you're interested in that or the deeper lore behind Subaru's schizophrenia, here's everything the anime left out from this episode. Let's get started. Episode 76, Murder is a Habit, covering chapters 4 and 5 from volume 23 of the light novel. After seeing Meili's lifeless body right in front of him, Subaru would try everything he could possibly remember from all the TV he'd watched. First it was CPR, then after it was an endless cycle of rescue breathing. Again and again, he would alternate both in hopes of bringing Meili back. Once he realized he couldn't, again, Subaru would vomit everything he'd just eaten for breakfast. Unlike how last time he'd gotten it all over Shala though, this time he was able to just barely avoid Meili. At this point, all Subaru could think was of how all he's done was vomit, but really those were just pointless thoughts intended to mask his heart from the terrible tragedy in front of him. It was before Subaru would notice the writing carved into him that he would first notice the tools which had done it. You see, after looking at his hands, he would notice blood and flesh underneath his fingernails. Just like Meili, he too had been scratching at something. That's when he'd discover his arm, a difficult-to-accept reality that sent Subaru into a frenzy. In fact, the reason he slammed his arm the way he did is because it was the only thing he could do to keep this terrifying piece of himself away from him. If he was able to cut his arm off here, then he probably would have. So, as Subaru wondered whether this Subaru Natsuki was the name of an incomprehensible elder god monster, Subaru's suspicions of his old self would only be confirmed. From his trust with the others to the secret with Aridina, all that seemed impossible for the Subaru who'd just come out of the convenience store. To him, it was actually more believable that someone was instead posing as him. There was no mistaking that this handwriting did in fact match his own though, so the person who wrote this message was undeniably him. Or at least a version of him. New Subaru could only assume it was old Subaru taking his body back, leaving new Subaru wondering who he was then. It was a terrible thing not knowing who was friend and who was foe, and it was even more terrible that he could no longer trust even himself now. New Subaru wasn't gonna let himself be manipulated though, so now he needed to find a way to get out of this. He wasn't sure how trials worked in this world, but considering the proof etched into his arms and the proof pressed into Meili's neck, Subaru knew any jury would find him guilty. That's why he decided to hide the body, since until he knew a way to protect himself, this was the only thing he could do. He wasn't gonna convince himself what he was doing was right, but at the very least, he found it necessary. When Subaru came across Amelia next, aside from the panic, his first thoughts were of how he was still uncertain she wasn't his killer. She definitely feigned innocence incredibly well, but with her and Beatrice being the only survivors of the last loop, it wasn't impossible that she hadn't killed all the others, collapsed the tower, and lopped his head off. Like, for all he knew, Amelia could have an accomplice. Believing that was more and more difficult every time Subaru talked to her though, since her genuine compassion opened him up completely. So much so that even after lashing out over her concern for someone who was dead, her literal heartfelt response immediately filled Subaru with shame. He had already regretted his outburst without Amelia having to do anything, but Amelia's soothing heartbeat made him feel ridiculous for even suspecting her to begin with. Not only that, This one conversation was enough for Subaru to start questioning all his other suspicions. He started to wonder whether someone was really out there trying to kill him, even going so far as to think perhaps his deaths could have all just been accidents. Perhaps there wasn't anyone bad in the tower to begin with. Perhaps the darkest and ugliest person here was just Subaru. These were the thoughts Subaru filled himself with, leading him to almost tell Amelia about everything. Because she had even gone so far as to embrace him with a hug, Subaru now felt zero reason to hide anything. Ram's arrival would unfortunately get in the way of that, and while Amelia did want Subaru to finish what he was saying, Ram's insistence meant he couldn't. Instead, Amelia would just have to remind Subaru to save it for later. Now, it was when the two arrived at the library that Beatrice would explain that she was here to investigate Subaru's collapse. Not only that, with the way this library was similar to her own forbidden archive, Beatrice felt it useful to analyze it. Of course, all that meant nothing to Subaru, up until the book was revealed to be Meili's. This flipped everything right on its head, since with Subaru only moments away from trusting Amelia, fate unfortunately had other plans. Subaru could now only ask himself a series of whys, questions like why did Meili's book appear so fast and why was it found so easily? Most importantly, why did it have to happen right when he was about to come clean? Well, any hope of doing so was now gone, instead replaced with how to handle this new predicament. Interestingly enough though, as tragic as it was for Meili's book to be found, Subaru was determined to see what was inside it. Since his other self was sure to make an appearance, Subaru wanted to see what that person looked like. So, when Shala suggested reading the book himself, that was the exact escape hatch Subaru was looking for. There was always the risk whatever caused him to lose his memories was still present in the archive, but with Julius having read a book and seeming fine himself, Subaru figured it was okay to chance it. Naturally, Beatrice would oppose, since with Meili being this person Subaru had grown so close to, she was worried experiencing her death would scar his heart beyond repair. His distance to her was much closer than the other Book of the Dead he read. Subaru knew he was okay to insist though, since realistically, Meili was only someone he'd known for a few hours now. To him, she was just a girl he hardly knew, not someone whose death would break him. So, as Subaru opened the book to search for himself, the life that was Meili's would be presented in quite the interesting manner. A triplet of lines would repeat over and over, yet it's only the last one that ever changes. First, she didn't know how to live, so had no way of finding a reason to die. Then she learned how to live and didn't think to die. Then finally, after being taken by Elsa, because she didn't know anywhere else to live, that's when she couldn't find a reason to die. Then, after having watched Elsa die over and over again, never once did she think that she would actually die. It was when she finally did that her inability to grieve and her inability to fight left her wondering if her life actually had any value. You see, to her, she was always just some defective product. In a way, Elsa was too, and that was mostly why they fit so well together. It was when this person she mimicked was finally gone though that, after a bit of time, Meili's soul finally made its own plea. Before, she had always lived doing as others wished her to live, but it was here in this cell that Meili decided to walk her own path. Or at least see where choosing her own path might take her. At the root of all that was one single question, and that was what she should do since she was the reason Elsa died. That's the answer Meili was looking for here in the library, discreetly so until she was caught. As we saw, she obviously didn't want to be seen, but what might not have been clear was just how much she didn't want to be seen. Not only did she go back fully intent on killing Subaru, she had even considered using everything she'd set up around the tower to wipe the slate clean. The novel doesn't specify what that is, but I can only assume it's a bunch of mob beasts ready to strike and take out everyone. In any case, with whoever this Subaru was seeing right through Meili's act, his words of helping Meili see what she wanted really resonated with her. All she wanted was to know what she wanted and what she should do next, so with Subaru offering exactly that, she was eager to finally get the answer. Unfortunately, that eagerness would lead to her death, all because of some made-up rule set. We don't know what those rules are, but in an additional line not shown in the anime, Subaru would be removing Meili knowing full well she'd be there in the next loop. whoever this Subaru was. They were very excited to let Meili know how high their expectations were for her next time. Of course, Meili didn't understand any of what Subaru was saying, but what she did know was that she was being killed. Her last thoughts questioned whether her life had meaning or not, followed by the rage she felt knowing Subaru was killing her. It was when she got to the end of her rope that her final thought was that she'd kill him. So all this was an interesting look into Meili herself. I guess she isn't as trustworthy as we initially thought, since she was fully ready to kill Subaru here. Now, it's at this point the novel stops referring to Subaru as Subaru and instead just calls him this. That's because Subaru's memories were so mixed with Meili's that until those memories leaked out, he would continue to be this amalgamation of both. Even his manner of speech was this weird combination of both his and Meili's. The novel then portrays Subaru's mind as this incoherent mess, a blurred line of names all melted together, unsure how to interact with each other. One could only be oneself, yet for Subaru here, he was yet to establish the line dictating that. So, if he was gonna reclaim his identity, he first needed to extract it from the blend that it was stuck in. What that meant is that all the right memories, impressions, and feelings needed to be plucked out. They had to be picked extremely carefully too, otherwise what would remain of him wouldn't actually be him anymore. Unfortunately, Subaru wasn't sure what was even his anymore, so what awoke after the book was yet another version of himself, one now combined with Meili. So, Subaru and Meili were now this mixed bag of identities, the novel referring to them interchangeably. It was when the group decided to go look for Meili after that Aridina would suggest Subaru read the book again. If he missed who killed Meili the first time, then all he needed to do was make it to the end the second time. Well, that was enough to make Beatrice scold Aridina, making her shout all in defense of Subaru. Immediately, Aridina would say the equivalent of just kidding, framing her suggestion as a test of Subaru's resolve. She said that even if Subaru did say yes, because of the danger of mixing memories, she wasn't actually gonna let him. They were words that Beatrice could only hope was true. So, when all was said and done, within Subaru's body there now existed 3 personalities. 2 Subarus and a Meili. Each had a wish of their own, and all those wishes were currently at odds with each other. So, with each fighting for dominance and each trying to grasp a future for their own self, the one that prevailed was the one that told Shala to take care of it. Now, Subaru's question to Beatrice actually has several layers to it, since with the Subaru she was so nice to being the same Subaru who killed Meili, killed Elsa, covered up his own death, and did so much worse, the other Subaru just couldn't understand why. Remember, with the Meili of the book ending her life wanting to kill Subaru, this disdain towards Subaru was doubled since now 2 personalities disliked him. They could only wonder why everyone else saw him in such high regard. That in turn transformed into a burning envy, one that consumed everything that was Subaru. Or perhaps I should say Meili now. Well, normally one could never understand exactly who another person was, but after experiencing the very essence of Meili the way he did, everything from how she lived down to her beliefs and her philosophies were all laid bare for Subaru to absorb into himself. It's for that reason he now knew the genuine Meili, including the fact there was someone that she cared deeply for. Not only that, Subaru also came to see how her heart was broken when that person was taken from her. He saw her confusion on how to feel when it came to the people who stole her from her. That's why Meili sought out Elsa's book, because that to her would help her better understand what she really felt. That and everything else Subaru was now aware of, so if the Book of the Dead could help him understand Meili like that, then perhaps another could help him understand Subaru. Just like how Meili was searching for the answer on how to feel about everyone, so too was Subaru looking for the same. Whether he should love or hate someone, Subaru believed the answer was here in the archive. Now, putting Meili's book back didn't really matter, as according to Beatrice, the order of the archive changed every time they entered. So, just because they found a book once, didn't mean that they'd be able to find it again. Fast forward now to the green room, and Beatrice's reaction to Subaru's wounds made it seem like these were a normal thing. Not in a way that made it seem like they came from training or fighting, but rather that it was natural for Subaru to mutilate himself. When Subaru started freaking out during this, it's because his aggressive thoughts were starting to dissipate. Meili's personality had stepped in to change that, reminding Subaru that if he was going to achieve his goal, he'd need to kill Beatrice. That's why Subaru said no, since for a moment, his more reasonable self was rejecting the negative feedback loop he'd been slipping into. He was even ready to confess should Meili's body be found, but fortunately for him, it never was. It was later when Aridina casually dropped the news that time was of the essence that she would also follow it up with a statement surprisingly relatable. While yes, just existing as Anastasia was in fact killing her, there was also the revolting feeling of residing within a container not meant to fit her. To Aridina, she felt like she was just borrowing someone's appearance, and the longer she did, the worse it felt. Well, in a way, that's exactly what Subaru was going through, so with the contents of his body not matching the container they were currently residing in, Aridina's words really resonated with him. It was after deciding to continue conquering the tower that only Amelia would commit herself to searching for Meili still. That to her was what was most important, so that was what she was going to do. It was after Subaru's bold lie telling the group that this is what Meili would have wanted that, as a quick aside, that's when the novel would explain the murder is a habit quote. The famous detective in question was Hercule Poirot, and the essence of it was pretty much as Subaru said. The moment someone considers murdering someone who need not be killed, already they've made too grave of a mistake. Even if the first time they killed wasn't because they wanted to, and even if they despised the very act of killing, because it was a solution that they're now considering again, murder was now a habit. A habit that becomes harder and harder to shake the more times it happens. Episode 77, ReZero, Life Starts in Another World, covering chapters 5 and 6 from volume 23 of the light novel. While Subaru's primary goal was to read everyone else's Book of the Dead, the Subaru of now was well aware doing so required much more of a plan. The easiest target was of course the one unable to fight back, but no matter how Meili pushed to go for her, she was nowhere near the top of his target list. The others required catching them by surprise, so while a plan like this was still far from complete, right now he was focused on another goal, figuring out why Meili's body was never found. Subaru had fully intended to come clean over what he'd done, but with no evidence tying him to the crime, that resolve to confess slowly withered. Now he was more concerned with making sure the body was never found. It was a decision he wasn't entirely happy to be making, but with Amelia fully intent on finding Meili no matter what, Subaru knew he'd never have peace of mind until Meili's corpse was gone completely. And without peace of mind, Subaru's plans of securing a future for himself would never be achieved. So his plan right now was to find the body, bring it out to the desert, and bury it. Well, as we saw, Subaru would fall for the oldest trick in the book, returning to the scene of the crime, assuming what everyone said at dinner was the truth. Turns out it was all just a trap, an elaborate bait starting with Amelia. She was the person Subaru fully thought was the easiest to trick, but in actuality, she was the one who saw through his performance first. So, Subaru hadn't been able to play Subaru well enough, and the idea of not being able to be even himself really got to him. Now his thoughts reverted back to violence, fully intending to do to Ram what he had done to Meili. It was no difference to him whether his victim count was 1 or 2, and part of who he was now a professional killer. So, with Meili pointing out the weakness that was the imbalance on Ram's left leg, Subaru felt fully confident that with a seasoned veteran guiding him, he could easily kill Ram. Unfortunately, Amelia would jump in to stop that, leaving Subaru's fate completely in her hands. It was here that Subaru would ask what it was that gave him away, wondering why, if Amelia knew, why did she still put her hopes into him anyway? Subaru wanted to know what it was that differentiated the old him and the new him, but the only answer he got was that what exposed him then was the same thing exposing him now. Now, as for why it was only Ram and Amelia here, well, with Amelia not knowing how the others might react, she had asked Beatrice to keep Julius and Aridina distracted. When Ram suggested that Subaru could very well be Capella, the part of him that was Meili twinged from the terror she'd previously experienced from her. The way she manipulated her life brought with it a terrible feeling Subaru unfortunately briefly experienced himself. That was the person Ram convinced herself she was dealing with, as it was the only believable solution given the circumstances. The excuse of lost memories was unacceptable, leading Ram to the aggressive action we saw in the anime. Her expression did look more on the pain side though, her eyes literally on the verge of tears as she questioned for answers. Subaru didn't know what to say that would help either her or him, but what he wondered instead was if perhaps the other Subaru knew. Would the Subaru they knew have been able to find the words which would have prevented this girl from crying? It was then that Ram would knock Subaru unconscious, the aftermath of which was different in the novels. You see, where in the anime Amelia's cage was broken, in the novel Subaru managed to slip out by dislocating his shoulder. The cage was still there, fully intact, indicating Amelia and Ram probably just left him here. So whoever took over his body dislocated his shoulder in order to fit through the gaps, then for some reason left behind all these ominous messages. It was a weird situation to awake to that filled Subaru with so many questions. The final one was, why had he not been able to tell his parents the truth? A clear underlying guilt that helps establish the regrets of who Subaru is now. That we'll see more of in just a bit, but for here when Raid showed up unexpectedly, the first thing he'd do was spew a few insults, then pop Subaru's dislocated shoulder back in. As for how Raid was able to walk around like this, it wasn't wrong for Subaru to assume that he couldn't, it's just whatever bound that assumption wasn't there anymore. That by itself was a very vague statement, but from the way Raid said it, I assumed the rules that limited him to the second floor were no longer in place. How those rules disappeared I couldn't tell you, but now that Raid was out, he was looking for someone. Specifically Shala, because before leaving the tower, he wanted to have food, water, alcohol, and a woman with him. Interestingly enough though, despite Subaru asking even more questions than what we saw in the anime, Raid's complaints back couldn't even be described as annoyance. For Raid to be annoyed, he first had to feel annoyed at something, but with Subaru's existence not even registering in Raid's mind, that feeling was never there to begin with. As for the he was referring to at the end of their interaction, there was no indication whether he was referring to Julius or someone else. That said, with Julius being the one he wanted to take care of, Raid would spew one last insult before joining Julius. The title of weakling wasn't one he was giving to Julius, but rather Subaru, since there Julius was fighting for his life, yet Subaru was cowering above doing nothing. Excuses were the only thing they were good at, since in situations like these, excuses were the only things they could muster. Now, it's here we get quite a bit more behind Julius and Raid's interaction with each other, including a bold quote hammering home who Raid was. After Julius asked the basic question of why Raid was here, Raid would answer by saying he and everyone else needed to focus on the more important questions. Questions like what's the best trick to being popular with the ladies, what's the best brand of booze, and finally why was he so strong? Well, the answer to the first was looks, the second a liquor called Gramhild, then the reason Raid was the strongest in the world was because he was him. He confidently declared so, all while easily dismantling the entire body of one of the centaurs. You'd think the wooden chopsticks he was using would have caught fire on the centaur's flames, but Raid was moving them so fast that they didn't have the chance to catch fire. Raid's true objective was Julius though, saying whatever was necessary to get him to engage. To Julius, fighting Raid was ridiculous though, since with mob beasts coming out of nowhere and the tower's state quickly deteriorating, he would suggest the two join forces and fight together. Well, to Raid, the mob beasts were less annoying than Rain, since where the Rain was at least effective in messing up his hair a bit, the mob beasts posed literally zero threat to him at all. It was the irrational logic only someone as powerful as him could have. Julius's exposure to it would finally bring out the emotion Raid was looking for, leading Raid to strike him first. Both still had to deal with the mob beasts that were hunting them, yet one was focused on their target while the other simply on surviving. It was a grim situation turned even more grim when Raid managed to land a kick on Julius. This gave the mob beasts the opportunity to take him out now, forcing Julius to put everything he had into evading. The thing is, even now, Raid could tell Julius wasn't getting serious, and that to Raid was unacceptable. So, Raid would send flying the dozen centaurs that were chasing Julius, chopping them up to bits all in a span of 2 seconds. Now the two could focus only on each other, but if Julius wasn't gonna provide the entertainment Raid was looking for, Raid was ready to just leave. As far as he was concerned, everyone except for Amelia was boring. For Subaru, who was watching all this, Subaru now knew that even if he did sneak up on Julius, never would he be able to beat him. He understood now that reading Julius's Book of the Dead was impossible. That's when Melee would step in to say this was the perfect opportunity to do so, since with more mobbies spawning from below Julius, all Subaru had to do was nothing. As much as this was the best chance to let Julius die though, as we saw, Subaru couldn't help but try to prevent that. It was then that Julius would entrust Subaru with some responsibility, leading to his encounter with Beatrice and Aridina. Aridina would be on the defensive the moment she saw him, pointing her finger straight to Subaru's head. It gave Subaru the feeling that she was pointing a gun at him. Beatrice would of course step forward to protect him, but with Subaru now fed up at pretty much everything, he would move her aside and declare the tower done for. Aridina would interpret this as Subaru already having achieved his goals, leading her to believe his objective was the witch. That's right, whatever the group found while Subaru was out, apparently it was related to a witch in a shrine of sorts. Subaru's attitude had changed the moment the witch was free, so it made sense to assume that that was all he had come for. Of course, Subaru had no idea what she was talking about, so again Subaru would reiterate this world was doomed. Not only that, he blamed his current circumstances solely on himself. Because he hated himself, the mask he forced himself to wear, and the problems he caused his parents, the reason Subaru was out the night he was transported was because he preferred to be anywhere but home. That's why Subaru believed this to be some sort of divine punishment, since once again, this was the result of him running away from his problems. So if there was a god out there that could hear him, then Subaru begged for mercy, saying he'd change. If nothing else, all he wanted was for him and everyone else to be free from all the hurt he caused. Subaru's pleas were enough for Aridina to make her compromise, but for some reason that wasn't enough for Subaru. Subaru didn't know why it was he had reached out towards Aridina, but with Melee calling him pathetic and even staring at him with disappointment, her words and gaze were what made it difficult to voice anything. That's when the group would be attacked, Aridina spamming several Geraldos even after having chased the Scorpion away. I guess when it came to Anastasia's survival, Aridina really wasn't gonna take any chances. As for what that mob beast was, apparently it was one that just all of a sudden appeared out of nowhere. That, however, wasn't the biggest problem, since what was the big changes happening both upstairs and down. Even the middle had several problems too, so all over the tower there were issues. Julius was taking care of mob beasts on the 5th floor, a giant scorpion was lurking on the 4th, and whatever happened upstairs was likely the reason for Raid coming down. Subaru was a problem in and of itself, but after having just saved Aridina for seemingly no reason at all, Aridina started to think that perhaps actions like this were just part of his nature. It was Beatrice's words after that would reforge her position as Subaru's pillar of support, a position he couldn't fully accept until now. Her words, combined with the feeling of her holding his hand, provided him a type of comfort he'd rarely felt since coming here. What happened next was a behavior in nature called autotomy, a general survival practice typically used by arthropods and lizards. It was the animal basically removing a piece of itself so it could escape a predator. Crabs sometimes did it with their pincers, and in this situation here, it seemed that the scorpion had done so too. Well, the scorpion's pincer wasn't just a lure to draw the attention of its enemy, it was actually a trap that sensed the approach of its prey then exploded. It was a unique use of autotomy that Subaru never would have predicted. Still, Subaru blamed himself anyway, since had he not let his guard down amongst Beatrice's hopes and Aridina's acceptance, Subaru felt that perhaps he could have predicted this trap. So, with yet another hardship adding to the many, Subaru wondered if this was just the world showing him he was incapable of growing. Adversity was, after all, the perfect opportunity to grow with, so why then were these instances of it only there to make him suffer? Subaru was actually able to share Beatrice's final moments with her, not knowing what to say as she melted away from reality. He did, however, notice her face, and the expression she had was that of relief. In the end, all she bore towards Subaru was affection, nothing more. It was Aridina's death that was infinitely more painful though, since after all the terrible things he'd both done and failed to do, for some reason Aridina would use her last breath to apologize. Subaru couldn't understand why, but the shame he felt after hearing those words was immense. In fact, now more than anything, Subaru just wanted to die. He would much rather that or have everyone in the world point at him and say he deserved to die. Despair was all Subaru could feel now, so as he awaited the punishment he was certain he deserved, what came instead was corruption. It was the feeling of his soul, his very existence being overwritten. As much as this was a desecration of life itself though, Subaru found relief knowing what he did to his old self was what was happening to him now. If anyone deserved to end up like this, then to Subaru that was undoubtedly him. He wanted to die, disappear, and forget everything. He wanted his body erased and his memories wiped. That was the exact same feeling he felt whenever he was with his parents, all the way to the unworthiness which stemmed from being on the receiving end of unyielding affection. For someone as unworthy of their love as he was, though, still his parents and this witch loved him regardless. It was a torture Subaru could endure no longer, so as he willingly accepted the fate which came with succumbing to the shadows, Amelia would jump in to save him. Remorse was all Subaru felt after seeing her face, since with everyone else having died after encountering him, it was only natural he assumed Amelia's turn was next. Each had also left a burden Subaru wasn't able to carry, feelings he failed to understand because he assumed only the original Subaru could. Whether it was faith, trust, or even basic acceptance, all added to the weight Subaru now found himself being crushed by. It just didn't make sense that all these people would rely so heavily on someone as hopeless as he was. So, when Amelia recounted how it was Subaru first came into her life, all Subaru could feel was envy and jealousy towards the Subaru he felt Amelia wanted him to be. His heart wouldn't allow him to accept that Amelia was accepting him the way he was, and instead saw it as her expressing a wish for the real Subaru to come back. He couldn't be the Subaru Julius entrusted, he couldn't be the Subaru Beatrice believed in, and he couldn't be the Subaru Aridina forgave. Now that Amelia was giving him this glimpse into what the old Subaru was capable of too, that was just another person Subaru couldn't be. So, as he expressed his disgust towards the person he felt he really was, what it all came down to was the feeling of being unworthy of anything. Not to walk beside them, and certainly not to carry their hopes like that. Amelia would help him to see that he was all those things and more, confirming it was in fact the Subaru she was looking at now that made everyone feel the way they did about him. That's why she would ask him his name, since she needed Subaru to hear it from himself that he alone was the one who earned those feelings. She wasn't rejecting the Subaru who'd forgot his memories, but was rather affirming he was who everyone else said he was. All Subaru wanted was to be rejected by her, but Amelia, along with everyone else, all wished for the exact same thing from him. Regardless of who he was or the state he was in, all their words and all their actions went to show they needed him. Every single one of them were relying on Subaru the way he was now. He was trusted, believed in, forgiven, and now wished for. It still didn't make sense how Subaru was able to carry all those burdens, but the moment Amelia expressed her love for him, that's when Subaru understood he had always been fighting for something. It was never just him that the old Subaru was fighting for, but rather someone else who he cared for deeply. As trivial of a reason as that was, it was a reason that Subaru could at least make sense out of. So, if what everyone needed in this tower was Subaru Natsuki, Subaru was committed to being exactly that. If Natsuki Subaru was the man everyone else placed their hopes in, Subaru resolved himself to be that person as best he could. Any hesitation he had in doing so was immediately dismissed the second Amelia had asked his name for a second time. So, while Subaru understood he was weak, powerless, filled with despair and worse, out of consideration for the bonds the old Subaru had made before him, the Subaru of now was ready to stake his all on that. All he wanted was for Amelia and the others to be saved. All he wanted was to help them. It's not like his suspicions of old Subaru were cleared at all, but his feelings about himself now came secondary to the safety of everyone else. That was Subaru's plea as he proclaimed himself Subaru Natsuki with unshakable resolve. He still wasn't sure if Subaru Natsuki was worthy of being loved, but what he was sure of was that Amelia and the rest were. So, even if they don't remember any of the words they shared or the bonds they made in this loop, Subaru was ready to take them into the next. he would never forget the memories everyone else had engraved into him here. Things might have to start out from zero again, but to Subaru that was just the beginning. It was the start of the battle to kill this Subaru and reclaim the real one. That's pretty much where the episode ends, bringing us to the end of the Lost arc. So, it was amazing to see Subaru's development start all over from zero again. Some of it was definitely tough to watch, but the payoff here was more than worth it. Like, it was pretty hyped to see our boy leap into action for the first time in a while. That, however, is all we've got until August, so until then, feel free to check out my Tensura or upcoming Mushoku Tensei videos. I'll be covering those until ReZero's back. For now, I hope you enjoyed watching this series, and if you did, then be sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe. As always, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, ciao!